Tane woke up to the silence. Usually, his mother was already clanging a pot in the kitchen and humming something under her breath. But this morning, the house was quiet. He threw off the blanket and walked barefoot across the cold floorboards to her room. The door was ajar. His mother was lying on the bed with her eyes closed. Her face was pale. Her lips were dry. The blanket was pulled up to her chin. Tane knelt down beside her and touched her hand. Her hand was warm. She was still breathing, but her breath came in short, ragged gasps. Tane knew this illness. His mother had been coughing since last fall. At first, rarely. Then every night. Then she started hiding her handkerchief with brown stains. She thought he didn't notice. He did notice. But he kept quiet because she kept quiet. That was the way of things in their house. Silence instead of the truth. He brought water from the kitchen. He lifted her head and brought the mug to her lips. She took a single sip. Then she opened her eyes. Her eyes were cloudy. She looked at him as if seeing him for the last time, and tried to memorize every feature. Tane said everything would be all right, and that he would go get the doctor from the village below. Mother shook her head. Her fingers clenched his wrist with unexpected strength. She whispered that the doctor wouldn't help. That she had known for a long time. That she might have an hour, maybe 2. And that before she left, she had to tell him what she'd been hiding for 16 years. Tane froze. His mother said his father wasn't a lumberjack, that she'd made up that story when he was still a baby. His father was the last of the ancients. His name was Caragor the Scarlet. Tane didn't immediately understand what she meant. The ancients were from fairy tales, dragons, the very ones that had been exterminated 400 years ago and on whose skulls the church altars stood. His mother said that Caragor was not a beast, but an intelligent being, that he could take human form, that he had come to Haven in the spring, that they had fallen in love, that a week after Tien was conceived, the Order of the Silver Spear found Caragor in a gorge beyond the pass and killed him. 7 hunters against a single dragon. Caragor took 5 of them with him. 2 survived and brought his head to the capital. His mother had been in hiding ever since. 16 years in a mountain village, a quiet widow and herbalist with a quiet son. No one knew. No one was supposed to know. She said his blood would awaken, that it had already begun, that he must have felt it in recent months, a heat beneath his skin, a ringing in his ears, dreams which he was flying. Tien listened and couldn't move, because it was all true. There was heat. There was ringing. The dreams were there. He'd chalked it up to a fever, to fatigue, to age. His mother said he had to leave Haven, that when the blood truly awoke, it would be impossible to hide, that the Order would find out, that they would come, and that they would show no mercy. Over the past 50 years, the Silver had executed 14 carriers, all of them as children, before the blood had a chance to awaken. She told him not to get angry, not to clench his fists, to keep it all inside until he learned to control it. Then her fingers unclenched. Her breathing grew even quieter. She looked at him one last time. Her lips moved. She said she loved him, and that his father would have loved him too. Then her eyes closed. Her chest rose and didn't fall. Tane sat on the floor next to the bed, holding her hand. Her hand was growing cold. He didn't cry. Something inside him was burning, literally burning. The heat rose from his stomach to his throat. Tane clenched his teeth. He inhaled through his nose. He exhaled. He stood up. He covered his mother with a clean sheet. He gathered some bread, a knife, and a flask of water into a bag. He went out into the yard. The sun was just rising over the mountains. The air was cold and clear. Tane stood on the threshold of the house where he had lived his entire life. He looked at the shed by the fence. Inside were hay and old tools. He sneezed. Not from the cold. Something twitched in his chest and burst out through his mouth and nostrils. An orange flame struck the wall of the shed. The dry wood burst into flames instantly. Half the structure was in 3 seconds. Tane recoiled. His hands were shaking. Smoke was coming from his nostrils. Thin, almost invisible, but he could feel it. He could taste the smoke and sulfur on his tongue. He looked at his palms. Ordinary palms. Nothing had changed on the outside. But inside, everything had become different. He looked around. No one in the neighboring houses had woken up yet. The flames roared. Soon they would wake up. Soon they would come running. Soon they would start asking questions. And in a week, the silver ones would be here. Tane slung the sack over his shoulder. He looked at the house, at the burning barn, at the window of the room where his mother lay. Then he turned and headed for the forest. The path led north through the dense spruce grove and on toward the pass. He didn't look back. Inside, he felt both empty and burning. He told himself that his mother had remained silent so that he might live, that he wouldn't let her down, that he would learn to hold on to this, learn to use it. And he wouldn't let them wipe out his lineage a second time. Tane walked all day. The path through the fir forest was narrow and overgrown. Few people traveled this way. The village of Haven stood high in the mountains, and the inhabitants descended to the trade routes via the southern pass. The northern path led to nowhere, to old mine shafts, to abandoned hunting huts, to stone and wind. That was exactly why Tane had chosen it. By noon, the forest had grown denser. The sun filtered through the branches in short streaks of light. Tane stopped by a stream and filled his flask with water. He sat down on a rock. He took out some bread. He took a bite and tasted nothing. The same thought kept spinning in his head. Caragor the Scarlet, the ancient dragon, his father, a sentient being older than mankind, slain by 7 hunters in the gorge beyond the pass. His mother had kept this secret for 16 years. For 16 years she had pretended to be an ordinary herbalist. For 16 years she had taught him not to get angry and not to clench his fists. Now he understood why. The heat in his chest wouldn't subside. It rose in waves, especially when Tane thought of his mother, about her pale face, about how her hand had gone cold. He clenched his teeth and exhaled slowly. Nothing came out. Good. He could control it if he breathed steadily, if he didn't think about the pain, if he didn't clench his fists. He walked on. By evening, the trail led to a rocky slope. The trees thinned out. Ahead lay a valley littered with rock debris. Tane found a hollow in the rock, something like a shallow cave. He gathered branches. He started a fire, a regular one, with flint and tinder. He was afraid to touch his inner fire. The night was cold. Tane lay on the hard ground and gazed at the stars through a gap in the rocks. Then he fell asleep. And he had a dream. He was flying. Not like in ordinary dreams, where the body is weightless and the ground below is blurry. He was flying at a monstrous speed. His wings tore through the air. A mountain range stretched out below. He saw every rock, every tree, every stream. He saw not with human eyes. The world was brighter and deeper. The colors were different. He could sense the warmth of living creatures through the treetops. A deer in the thicket, a bear in its den, a mouse beneath the roots. Then he looked down at himself and saw not hands, paws, huge ones covered in scarlet scales, claws like blades. He turned his head and saw a wing, a membranous one, dark red with streaks of fire. This was not his dream. It was the memory of blood. He saw the world through Caragor's eyes. He felt what his father had felt. The wind on the scales, the power in every beat, and loneliness. The deep, familiar loneliness of the last of his kind. Tane woke up with a start. His heart was pounding. Sweat trickled down his temples. His hands were shaking. He sat up and stared at his palms. Human. Ordinary. But for a moment it seemed to him that the skin on the back of his hand was slightly rougher than it had been yesterday. He ran a finger over it. No, not yet. He sat there until dawn without closing his eyes. On the second day of his journey, he stumbled upon footprints, heavy boots, 2 or 3 people, heading from south to north, recently. The ground was still damp where the prints had been. Tane froze. Hunters. Traders don't take the northern trail. Peasants don't either. Only those who are searching, or those who are being searched for. He stepped off the trail and made his way up the slope through the windfall. He walked quietly. His mother had taught him to walk through the woods so that not a single branch would snap, although he would have been grateful for that. By noon, he had reached a rocky ridge. Down in the hollow stood a hunting camp. 2 tents, an extinguished fire, horses tied to a tree, and 3 men. Tane lay down on a rock and watched. 2 were young, in leather armor, with swords at their belts. The third was older, burly, with a gray beard and a scar across his left eyebrow. He sat by the fire and cleaned his sword. Not an ordinary sword. Long, with a wavy blade and a silver pommel. Tane knew this type of weapon. Travelers sometimes came to the village and told stories. A silver pommel meant the order, the silver spear. They were already here, but only 1 day had passed. His mother had said it would take them a week, so these 3 had been here before the fire. So they weren't after him. They were after something else, or someone else. Tane lay on the rock for an hour. Then the 2 young men left down the trail to the south. The old man stayed behind. He didn't bother to break camp. Instead, he pulled a flask from his bag and began to drink, long and unhurriedly. Tane decided to circle around the camp, to climb down the ridge on the other side and get as far away as possible. He began to crawl away. A pebble crunched under his hand, a faint sound. But the old man below froze. He raised his head. He looked straight at the ridge. Tane pressed himself against the rock and held his breath. The old man stared for a long time. Then he stood up. He raised his sword and began climbing the slope toward the ridge. Slowly, confidently, like a man who had done this 100 times. Tane realized it was too late to run. The old man was coming straight for him. Heat surged into his chest. Tane clenched his teeth. Not now. Not now. He pressed himself against the rock and waited. The old man reached the ridge. He saw him. He stopped. They stared at each other. Then the old man sheathed his sword. He sat down on a rock 3 paces away and said that he had nothing to fear, that he was no longer a silver, that he had deserted the order 20 years ago, that he had seen the fire in Haven, and that he knew who he was, because he had known his father. Tane didn't move. The old man said his name was Hagrin, that he had been a knight of the Order of the Silver Spear, that 20 years ago his squad had captured a 4-year-old carrier boy in a coastal village. He had been ordered to carry out the execution. He did. That evening he took off his cloak, left his sword in the barracks, and walked away. He's lived in the mountains ever since. Hunts, drinks, tries to forget that boy's eyes. He can't. Tane asked how he knew Caragor. Hagrin paused. Then he replied that 30 years ago, before he deserted, he had been in the squad that tracked down Caragor the Red. But by the time they reached the gorge, Caragor was already dead. Another squad had beaten them to it. Hagrin saw the body. A dragon the size of 3 houses. Red scales as dull as cooled coal. 5 dead hunters lying around. And 2 survivors who had already sawed off the head. Hagrin said he hadn't forgotten a thing since that day. That Caragor was beautiful, even in death. That killing such creatures was a mistake. That 400 years ago, people had committed a crime, and that he was ready to help Caragor's son if he would let him. Tain was silent. The heat in his chest slowly receded. He looked at the old man, at his weary face, at the scar, at the hands that had once killed a child, and at the eyes in which that murder still burned. Tain said he needed help, that he didn't know where to go. He didn't know how to control what was inside him, and he didn't know who he could trust. Hagrin nodded. He said that 2 young men had gone to Haven to check on a report of a fire, that they would be back in 2 days, and that in those 2 days they needed to get far away. Tain stood up. Hagrin stood up. They went down to the camp. Hagrin took 1 horse. He untied the rest and slapped them on the rump. The horses went into the forest. They headed north. They walked for 2 days without stopping for more than an hour. Hagrin led the way. He knew the northern mountains like the back of his hand. Every crevice, every hidden pass, every stream where they could get water without going down into the valley. The horse carried the supplies. Tain walked. He preferred to walk. Movement helped him think, and there was plenty to think about. Hagrin said little, only what was necessary, where it was safe to build a fire, how to cover their tracks, how to tell by the birds if there were people nearby. When the jays fell silent, it meant a stranger has entered the forest. When crows circle, it means there's a carcass down below, or there will be soon. On the second evening, they came upon an abandoned coal pit on the slope. Stone walls. The roof had long since collapsed, but they could stretch a hide over it. Hagrin said they would stay here for a week. Teen asked why a week. Hagrin replied that Teen couldn't go any further yet. Not because he was weak, because it's dangerous. Every time the heat rises in his chest, any spark could start a fire. Teen knew he was right. It had happened twice on the way. The first time, his foot slipped on a wet rock, and he nearly fell off the cliff. Fear pushed the heat upward. Smoke came out of his nostrils. Hagrin noticed and said nothing. The second time was at night. A dream, the memory of blood again. This time, not a flight, a battle. Caragor stood in the gorge. Trees were burning all around him. Before him stood 7 figures in silver cloaks, spears with dragon bone tips. It was his own bone. The bone of his ancestors remelted into a weapon against him. Caragor roared. The earth shook. Tain felt his rage as his own, ancient, inhuman. Then a spear pierced his neck, and Tain woke up with a scream. A jet of fire shot from his mouth, short, 1/2 meter. It scorched the stones above his head. Hagrin rolled back against the wall and drew his knife. Then he saw what was happening and put it away. He waited until Tain stopped trembling. He said they needed to learn, now. In the morning, Hagrin sat him down on a rock by the pit, told him to close his eyes, breathe, not through his mouth, only through his nose, slowly. Tain breathed. Hagrin asked if he felt the heat. Tain said yes, always, like coals in his stomach. Hagrin nodded, said that was the core. Every ancient had a core inside, a focal point of power. For red dragons, it's fire. The core burns constantly. It cannot be extinguished. But one can learn to keep the flame steady, to keep it from exploding. Hagrin wasn't a dragon. He couldn't show him how. But he had seen Caragor back in the days when he was still alive. He had seen how the dragon breathed, steady, deep. How the flame emerged from his mouth in a thin, controlled stream, not an explosion, a flow. They trained for 3 days. Tane would sit in front of a stone wall. He closed his eyes. He breathed. Then he opened his mouth and tried to release the flame, controlled. The first day was a failure. The fire burst out in fits and starts. One moment nothing, the next a 2-meter column. Tane burned his lips. Hagrin brought snow from the summit and applied it to the burn. The second day was slightly better. Tane learned to sense the moment before the burst, that split second when the heat was already in his throat but hadn't come out yet. In that split second, he could squeeze. Not block it, but specifically squeeze it, as if he were clamping his throat shut on a half exhale. The fire came out thinner, shorter. On the third day, he held the flame for 3 seconds for the first time. A steady stream 1 meter long, orange with a white heart. It struck the rock and left a black stain. Tane sat on the ground and stared at the stain, then at his hands. Then he cried, quietly, soundlessly. Hagrin stood to the side and said nothing. He understood. It wasn't fear or joy. It was all of it at once. The realization that a power capable of burning mountains lived within him, and that he had just learned not to burn himself. On the 4th day, Hagrin took something wrapped in a rag out of his bag. He unwrapped it. A feather. A large one. As long as Tane's forearm. Scarlet. Even after all these years, it glinted as if alive. Hagrin said it was Karagor's last feather. He'd found it in the gorge the day after the dragon's death. He'd taken it, kept it for 30 years. Tane took the feather. It was warm. Not from the sun, from the inside, as if something of his father remained in it. The heat in his chest stirred. Not a flash, but something soft. Tane ran his finger over the surface of the feather. The scales were smooth and hard, stronger than steel. He remembered what his mother had told him. The best armor in the world was forged from the scales of the ancients. Spearheads were made from their bones. For 400 years, people had built their greatness on the remains of those they had killed. Tane put the feather in his inner pocket. He pressed it to his chest. That evening, they sat by the fire. Hagrin took a worn leather pouch out of his bag. He poured the figurines onto a rock. Small, carved from bone, white with a yellowish tint. Checkers. Hagrin arranged them on a flat stone and suggested they play. Tane looked at the pieces. He asked what they were made of. Hagrin paused. Then he said they were made of dragon bone. Tane pulled his hand back. Hagrin shook his head. He said these bones were from his lineage, and that at least this way they could serve him. Tane stared at the pieces for a long time. Then he picked one up, placed it on the stone. They played until midnight. Hagrin won 7 times out of 8. On the 5th day, Tane woke up from an itch. His back was burning, not from heat, but from something else, as if his skin were being pulled from the inside. He took off his shirt and asked Hagrin to look. Hagrin looked. He was silent for a long time. Then he said that a spot had appeared on his back, between his shoulder blades, the size of a palm. The skin there had become thicker and darker, with a slight reddish tinge. A scale. The first scale. Tane felt the spot. His fingers found the edge. Normal skin, and next to it something hard, smooth, and warm, like his father's feather in his pocket. He looked at Hagrin. Hagrin said this was only the beginning, that the scales would grow. First the back, then the chest, then the arms. it would become harder and harder to hide. Tane nodded, pulled his shirt back on, stood up and walked to the rock, opened his mouth and exhaled. A steady stream of fire, 3 meters long. 4 seconds. The rock turned black. Tane wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. There was no smoke coming from his nostrils. Clean. On the 7th day, they left the coal pit. Hagrin said it was dangerous to stay any longer. The 2 young hunters he had sent ahead would return to camp and discover the missing horse and equipment. They would have reported it to the higher-ups. In a week, the area would be combed through. They headed east. Hagrin knew a pass through the ridge that wasn't marked on the maps. A narrow trail along the edge of a cliff. Clouds below. The horse moved reluctantly. Tane followed behind, holding her reins. The heat in his chest now burned evenly. It hadn't disappeared, but it had become predictable, like a pulse. Tane was getting used to it. At the pass, the wind blew so strongly that they had to walk bent over. Hagrin led the way and checked the rocks. Once, a slab beneath his foot cracked, and a chunk of rock plummeted down. Tane grabbed the old man by the collar and yanked him back. Hagrin grunted. He looked at Tane's hand. He said his grip was like a blacksmith's vice. Tane let go. A dent remained on the collar. He looked at his fingers. His mother had always said he was strong. Strangely strong for a boy from a mountain village. Now he knew why. Blood. With every hod, his body changed. Not just the scales. His muscles grew denser. His stamina had increased. They walked for 12 hours, and Tane felt no fatigue. Hagrin did. He was 64. His knees ached. His back ached. A flask of something strong helped, but not for long. Tane suggested they stop. Hagrin refused. At the pass, they saw a valley on the other side of the ridge. Green, with a river and a scattering of villages along the banks. Further to the east, the haze of a city. Hagrin said these were the lands of the county of Merensky, neutral territory. Count Mirren doesn't care for the order, and won't let the Silver Ones onto his lands without a royal decree. They could catch their breath here. They descended into the valley by evening. They found an abandoned mill by the river. The roof was intact. The walls were sturdy. The wheel had long since rotted away, but inside it was dry. Hagrin stoked the fire in the old stove. Tane sat against the wall and relaxed for the first time in a week. A mistake. He woke up in the night in pain. The scales on his back had spread. The patch now stretched from his neck to his lower back. The skin around it burned and itched. Tane lay on his stomach, breathing through clenched teeth. Hagrin hadn't slept. He sat beside him, wiping his back with a wet rag. It didn't help, but it gave him the feeling that someone was there. By morning, the pain had subsided. Tane got up and took off his shirt. Hagrin examined him. His whole back. Scarlet plates. Small ones, each the size of a fingernail, smooth and warm. They overlapped like fish scales. Beautiful. And Tane got dressed and didn't mention it all day. 2 days later, they decided to go down to the village for supplies. Hagrin went alone. Tane waited at the mill. Hagrin returned with bread and dried meat and salt and a sack of oats for the horse. And with news. At the inn, they were talking about a fire in a mountain village to the west. They said the Silver Ones had sent 3 detachments to the area. They said they were looking for a carrier. Tane asked, 3 detachments? Hagrin nodded. Usually they send 1. 3 means they know what they're dealing with. Or they're afraid. Hagrin also brought something else. A flyer. Yellow parchment with a stamp. The Order of the Silver Spear was offering a reward for information on a 16-year-old boy. Tall, dark-haired, from the mountain village of Haven. The reward? 200 gold crowns. Tane looked at the flyer. 200 crowns. With that kind of money, a peasant family could live for 3 generations. Every person in this valley was now his enemy, if they found out. Hagrin said he needed to change his appearance. Tane didn't understand how. Hagrin took out a knife. He cut his hair short, almost to the scalp. Then he gave him an old hat with wide brims and a rough woven cloak. He said that now he was his nephew, a village simpleton being taken to a doctor in the city, if anyone asked. Tane gave a crooked smile, his first smile in 10 days. They stayed at the mill for 3 more days. Tane trained every morning. He'd go to the river behind the mill. There were rocks there, large boulders left over from the flood. He aimed at them. He controlled the length of the blast. 1 second, 2, 3. He trained and learned to extinguish the flame instantly. He learned to direct the stream not only straight ahead, but also slightly to the side, by turning his head. On the 3rd day, he tried exhaling through his nose. 2 thin streams of fire burst from his nostrils, short, 30 centimeters, but precise. He could have lit a candle on the table without singeing the tablecloth. Hagrin watched from the shore. He said that Karagor had spent decades learning this. Tane had mastered it in a week. Blood is in a hurry. Tane didn't know whether to rejoice or fear this. Every use of the power hastens the awakening. Hagrin had explained this on the very first day. The more fire, the faster the body changes. The faster the body changes, the less of a human remains in it. It's a race. Tane is running in both directions at once. He's learning to control the power, and with every training session, he loses control of his body. The scales on his back have already begun to spread to his ribs. In the evenings, Tane undressed in front of a shard of mirror he'd found at the mill. He counted the new plates. Yesterday, they reached halfway down his ribs. Today, a little higher. He counted them like a condemned man counts the days. Every morning, the question, how much longer until full awakening? How much longer until he ceases to be Tane? On the 12th day since leaving Haven, they heard horses. Tane was by the river. Hagrin was at the mill. The sound of hooves from the southern road. Many, not 2 or 3. Tane darted back. Hagrin was already standing at the door with his sword. He said they weren't peasants. Tane listened. The hooves were measured, heavy, war horses. The clang of metal, armor. Hagrin cursed. He said it was Count Marin's patrol. They were patrolling the valley. If they saw 2 vagabonds at an abandoned mill, they'd start asking questions. Tane asked what to do. Hagrin replied that they needed to go out and be his dim-witted nephew. They went out. A minute later, 6 horsemen rode out onto the road. Heavy cavalry, plate armor, the county's coat of arms on their cloaks. The commander in front, young, about 25. He saw Hagrin and Tane and raised his hand. The squad stopped. The commander asked who they were. Hagrin replied that he was an old mercenary, taking his nephew to the doctor in town. The boy was a bit out of it after a fever. The commander looked at Tane. Tane stood slumped in a wide-brimmed hat. He stared at the ground. He had a vacant look in his eyes. The commander asked what was wrong with him. Hagrin replied that it was a fever from a swamp fly bite. He shivers at night. He can't really speak. The commander nodded. Then his gaze lingered on Hagrin's sword. The silver pommel was wrapped in a rag, but the hilt still looked too expensive for an old mercenary. The commander asked where the sword came from. Hagrin replied that it was a trophy. He'd taken it from a dead man 20 years ago. The commander stared at it for a few more seconds. Then he turned his horse around. The squad moved on down the road. Hagrin stood there until they disappeared around the bend. Then he exhaled. He said it was time to leave. The commander wasn't a fool. He'd memorized the faces. And if a flyer with Teen's description reached him, he'd put 2 and 2 together. They packed their things in 10 minutes and set off north along the river. 3 days along the river. Hagrin led the way through the reeds and alder thickets along the bank. They couldn't take the roads. After the encounter with the patrol, every person on the road was a risk. 200 gold crowns turned anyone they met into a hunter. Teen walked in silence. His hooded cloak hid his face. He had thrown away his hat. It had hindered his hearing, and his hearing had become keener. He noticed this on the second day of the journey. The footsteps of a deer 100 meters away, the splash of a fish underwater, Hagrin's heartbeat, steady, heavy, with pauses. The old man was ill. He didn't speak of it, but Teen heard it. Every fourth beat was delayed. The blood was changing more than just his body. His senses were sharpening. The world was becoming louder, brighter, more intense. Tain could see in the dark almost as well as in daylight. He could distinguish smells he hadn't noticed before. Wet earth, resin, rust from old iron, a horse's sweat, and something else, something new. He could sense people. He didn't see them, he didn't hear them, he sensed them. A warm, living presence behind the trees, behind the walls, in the distance. Hagrin said this was the beginning of dragon sight, just the first layer for now. There would be more later. Later, he would be able to see lies. On the third day, they reached the foothills. The river narrowed and disappeared into a gorge. Hagrin said they couldn't go any further by water. They had to climb. There was a place up there, an old temple, abandoned. One of those built before the Purge, when humans and dragons lived side by side. The climb took half a day. There was no trail. They scrambled over rocks and roots. They left the horse below. It wouldn't have made it. Hagrin was breathing heavily. His heart was skipping every third beat. Teen carried both bags, his own and Hagrin's. The old man didn't argue. By evening they had reached the plateau, and Teen saw the temple. A stone building carved into the rock, walls of gray granite. The roof had collapsed in one spot. The columns at the entrance were covered in moss. There was carving on the pediment. Teen stepped closer and froze. The carving depicted a dragon, a huge one, with outstretched wings, and people beside it. Not warriors with spears, people standing nearby, peacefully. The dragon and the people, together. Teen ran his finger over the stone. 400 years ago, this was the norm. They went inside. A hall, large, a stone floor, walls with remnants of murals. The paint had faded, but in some places it was still visible. Dragons of different colors, scarlet, white, green, black, and people beside them. There were inscriptions on the walls, an ancient language. Teen couldn't read it. Neither could Hagrin. But he said he'd heard of such temples. They were meeting places, where people and the ancients spoke as equals, where they made treaties, where they learned from one another, before it all fell apart. They settled in a far corner of the hall. Hagrin lay down and fell asleep instantly. Tain couldn't sleep. He walked around the temple with a candle stub. He examined the walls. In one of the side rooms, he found shelves, stone ones, built into the wall. Scrolls lay on some of them. Most crumbled to dust at the slightest touch, but 3 had survived. Thick parchment. The edges were torn, but the text remained intact. An ancient language. Tain sat on the floor and looked at the scrolls. He couldn't read them, but a heat stirred in his chest when he unrolled the first one, as if his blood recognized something. He closed his eyes, concentrated. The letters swam before his eyes. Strange, angular, unlike any alphabet he had ever seen. But there was something familiar about them, like a word rolling on the tip of his tongue. Tain opened his eyes. Not today, but maybe tomorrow, or in a week. The memory of his blood was working, slowly, but it was working. In the morning, Tain stepped out onto the plaza in front of the temple. The plateau dropped away for hundreds of meters. He could see far into the distance, the river below, the valley, the haze of villages, and something else on the horizon. Tane squinted. His vision had improved, but not quite enough yet. He asked Hagrin what lay to the east beyond the horizon. Hagrin said the capital, Averon. The king sits there. The main citadel of the Order of the Silver Spear stands there, and the archives of the Great Purge are kept there. Everything known about the ancients, all the records, all the names of those killed, all the secrets. Tane nodded. He remembered. They stayed in the temple for 4 days. Every day, Tane tried to read the scrolls, without success. But at night, he had new dreams. The memory of blood unfolded like a book being opened one page at a time. He saw Karagor in this very temple, hundreds of years ago. The dragon stood in the hall in human form, tall, dark-haired, resembling Tane. People in white robes stood nearby. They spoke, argued, discussed something important. Tane did not hear the words. He only saw. But he understood from their gestures and faces. These were negotiations. The people pleaded. The dragon listened. Then he nodded. They shook hands. That's how it used to be. Equality. Respect. Then it ended. On the 5th day, Tane woke up to a strange scent. Not Hagrin. Someone else. Alive. Warm. Close. He opened his eyes and didn't move. He listened. Breathing. Light. Rapid. Frightened. At the far end of the hall. Tane slowly turned his head. A figure stood at the entrance. Short. In a dark, hooded cloak. Standing and looking at him. Tane sat up. The figure recoiled. Then froze. Tane could sense her fear. Thick. Sour. But beneath the fear was something else. Something familiar. Heat. Not like his. Different. Cold. Like ice in fire. Tane stood up. He took a step. The figure backed away. The hood slipped down. A girl. His age or slightly older. Pale. Hair almost white. Light gray eyes. She looked at Tane, and her breath turned to steam. In the warm hall, her breath was cold. Tane stopped. He looked at the mist. He looked into her eyes. He saw in them the same thing he had seen in the mirror. Fear, loneliness, and heat. Only for her it was cold. He asked who she was, quietly, so as not to wake Hagrin. The girl was silent. Then she said she had come here because she had dreamed of this temple, that she had been walking for 3 weeks, that her name was Sarah, that she had been a nun at the convent of the White Sisters on the coast, and that 2 months ago, frost had formed on her palms, right in the middle of prayer. Tane understood. The white dragon. Ice. She was a bearer too. He sat down on the floor, slowly, so as not to scare her. He said his name was Tane, that he was a bearer too. Red. Fire. Sarah stood there for another minute. Then her shoulders slumped. The tension left her. She sat down across from him. They looked at each other in the semi-darkness of the temple. 2. The last children of a dead people. They found each other in a place where their ancestors once stood alongside humans. Tane felt the heat in his chest respond to her cold. Like 2 poles. Attraction. Not human. Deeper. Blood to blood. Ancient to ancient. Sarah said the Silvers had burned her sanctuary 3 days ago. One of the sisters had ratted her out. She had fled. Alone. Without food. Without weapons. She went north because the dreams told her to go north. The dreams led her to the temple. Tane nodded. Dreams. The memory of blood. It worked the same for everyone, calling her home, to her own, to the few who remained. Hagrin woke up. He saw Sira. He looked at Tane. Teen said she was just like him. Hagrin stood up. He walked over. He looked at the girl, at her white hair, at the steam coming from her mouth, at the frost that covered the stone around her in a thin layer. Hagrin nodded. He said that meant there were 2 of them now. Sira asked, 2 out of how many? Hagrin replied that he didn't know. In 50 years, the Order had found 14. They'd killed them all. But the Order might not have found them all. There could be more out there somewhere. Teen looked at Sira. She looked at him. Thin wisps of steam and smoke floated in the air between them. Cold and heat, ice and fire. He said he would find the rest. That if dreams had led her to him, then others were having dreams too. That he would gather them, everyone who was left. Sira looked at him for a long time. Then she asked, "And then what?" Teen replied that then they would stop hiding. Sira didn't trust Hagrin. Teen could tell by the way she sat, always with her back to the wall, always facing the old man, her hand under her cloak, ready. Teen didn't blame her. A man with the silver spear's sword, former or not. For a girl who, 3 days ago, had been running from people just like them, it didn't matter. Hagrin understood and didn't intrude. He kept his distance. He spoke only when asked. For the first 2 days, Sarah barely spoke. She ate little. She slept by the entrance. Teen brought her food and left it on a rock nearby. He didn't come close. He waited. On the 3rd day, she spoke up on her own. She told her story. The convent of the White Sisters stood on a rocky promontory overlooking the sea. 40 nuns, a quiet place. Prayers, herbs, copying books. Sira was brought there at the age of 3. Her mother gave her away and disappeared. The Mother Superior took the child and asked no questions. Sarah grew up among books and prayers. She was quiet, diligent, strange. In winter, she was always warm while the others froze. In summer, a cool breeze emanated from her. The sisters joked that she was born with a heart of ice. No one was joking 2 months ago, when during morning prayers, frost began to form in her palms. White crystals spread across the stone floor. The bench beneath her was covered in frost. Her breath became visible, as if in a severe frost, in the middle of summer. The Mother Superior saw it. She turned pale. She took Sarah to her cell. She locked her in. Sarah sat there for a day. Then, at night, a novice came, a very young one. She said that the Mother Superior had sent a dove to the capital, that people would arrive in the morning, that Sarah needed to flee. The novice opened the door and showed her a path through the rocks down to the shore. Sarah ran barefoot over the stones. 3 weeks, northward, because the dreams spoke of the north. She didn't know she was a bearer. She didn't know about the ancients. At the convent, the purge was taught as a great victory of good over evil. Dragons were monsters. Their destruction was a feat. Now Sarah sat in a temple whose walls told a different story. She looked at the frescoes, at the dragons and the people standing beside them, and she was silent. Tane told her what he knew, about her father, about Caragor, about the purge, about the order, about the 14 murdered children. Sarah listened. Her face was motionless, only her fingers clenched, and the air around her grew cold. When he finished, she asked if that meant she was a dragon. Tane replied that she was half one, that she had the blood of the ancient one, the white one, ice, that the blood was awakening, and would continue to awaken. Sarah looked at her hands. She ran a finger across her palm. A thin trail of frost remained on her skin. She said that at the monastery they had been taught that dragons were mindless beasts, that the purge had saved the world. Tane showed her the temple wall, a fresco where a dragon and a human shake hands. He said the wall told a different story. Sarah stared at it for a long time. Then she nodded. From that day on, she began to train. Tane trained with fire. Sarah trained with ice. It didn't go well. Worse than Tane had at the beginning. She could cover a stone with frost. She could freeze the water in a flask with a single touch. But she couldn't control the flow. The frost came and went as it pleased, especially when she was nervous, or angry, or afraid. Hagrin watched. Then he offered to help. Sarah refused. She was blunt. Hagrin backed off. Tane approached her afterward. He said Hagrin wasn't an enemy, that he'd deserted because he couldn't bring himself to kill children, that he'd kept his father's quill for 30 years. Sarah replied that she needed time. Tane said there was no time, that the Order was looking for both of them, that 3 squads were already in the mountains, that every day without training was a risk. Sarah looked at him. Her eyes were cold, gray, like ice on a mountain lake. Then she said, "Okay." Hagrin began to teach them both. Not dragon power. He couldn't. He taught what he knew. Combat. Close combat. With swords, with knives, unarmed. Tane was stronger. Blood gave him muscle and speed. But he was clumsy, a country boy with no training. Hagrin had him practice his stance. A strike, block, dodge, over and over, with a stick for a sword, because they had only one real sword. Sarah turned out to be faster, petite, agile, her movements precise. Hagrin said she had talent. Sarah didn't answer, but she stopped sitting with her back to the wall when Hagrin was nearby. At night, Tane studied the Mirith. He sat by candlelight and traced the lines with his finger. The memory of blood guided him. Slowly, word by word. After a week, he had deciphered the first sentence. It stated that fire and ice are one, that heat and cold are 2 faces of the same power, that the ancients were not divided into types by the elements. The element chose them, Tane told Sarah. She fell into thought. Then she held out her hand. Tane held out his. Their palms met. His hand burned. Her hand froze. Where they touched, the air hissed. A thin stream of steam rose upward. Heat and cold. 2 faces of a single force. They pulled their hands away at the same time. Both were breathing heavily. It was a strange sensation. Not pain, resonance, as if something inside had recognized something inside the other. Blood to blood. Hagrin saw it. He said nothing. He merely nodded to himself. On the 10th day in the temple, Tane woke up to the earth shaking. A slight tremor, brief. Dust rained down from the ceiling. He sat up. Hagrin was already standing with his sword. Sarah was by the wall. The shaking stopped. Silence. Then again, a brief jolt, as if Huge was stirring deep underground. Hagrin turned pale. Tane asked what it was. Hagrin was silent for a long time. Then he said that the old legends spoke of something sleeping beneath the mountains, of something that 400 years ago had forced dragons and humans to forget their enmity and unite, of something older than the ancients themselves, and that it awoke once every 1,000 years. Tane asked what exactly. Hagrin shook his head. He said he didn't know, that they didn't talk about it in the Order, that it was one of those stories old men tell by the fire and which no one believes. The earth shook twice more that night. By morning, it had subsided, but Tane could feel it, deep below, beneath the stone and rock. Heat. Not his heat. Someone else's. Ancient. Immense. He didn't tell anyone about it. 2 weeks later, in the temple, Teen was reading the scrolls almost fluently. The memory of blood was unfolding faster. Every night a new dream, a new page. He woke up with words in a language he hadn't known the night before. The letters of the ancient language formed in his mind like a familiar script. He no longer traced his finger along the lines. He read with his eyes. The first scroll, the treaty. A detailed description of how humans and the ancients divided the continent of Arid. The mountains to the dragons, the plains to the humans. The coast shared, trade in knowledge. The dragons taught humans how to work with fire and metals. Humans taught the dragons agriculture and construction. The ancients could take human form, but not all of them wanted to. Many considered it a humiliation. Others saw it as a bridge between the species. The disputes had raged for centuries. Scroll 2. Chronicle. A list of events from 300 years before the Purge. Tain read, and his heart ached. There were names, dozens of names of the ancients, with descriptions of scale, color, and element. Scarlet, white, green, black, silver, gold. There were species he had never heard of. Storm, sand, stone. An entire people, intelligent, ancient, wiped out in a single generation. Scroll 3. Warning. This was the scroll Tain spent the longest reading. The language was more complex, more archaic, as if it had been written by someone very old, even by the standards of the ancients. The text spoke of that which sleeps in the depths. It called it the firstborn, a being that existed before the dragons, before humans, before the elves, which had slept ever since the world cooled, which had awakened 3 times in all of history. Each time the continent changed shape. The last time the firstborn stirred was 1,000 years before the scroll was written. Then the ancients and humans joined forces to put it back to sleep. The ritual cost the lives of 12 dragons and 100 humans. The scroll warned that the firstborn would awaken again, and that when it happened, they would need those who remembered, those in whose blood memory lives. Tain set the scroll aside. He looked at his hands. Scales reached up to his wrists, scarlet plates on the backs of his palms. He turned his hands, and the scales caught the candlelight. Beautiful. And alien. His hands were no longer entirely human. He told Hagrin and Sarah about the scrolls. Hagrin listened in silence. His face was heavy. When Tain finished, the old man said that the earth had trembled 3 times in the last week, that the tremors were getting stronger, that if the scroll wasn't lying, they had a problem bigger than the order. Sarah asked how much bigger. Tain replied that it was a creature that would reshape the continent upon awakening. Sarah fell silent. Then she said she needed a drink. Hagrin handed her his flask. She took a sip. She grimaced. She spat it out. It was the first time Sarah had accepted anything from Hagrin. A small gesture, but Tain noticed. They began to prepare to leave. The temple was a good hideout, but not a fortress. If the Order found them here, there would be nowhere to go. 1 path up, 1 path down. A trap. Hagrin suggested going further north toward the Grey Ridge. There was a network of caves in the mountains there. Some stretched for kilometers. You could hide an army. Or 4 people. Tain asked why 4. Hagrin looked at him. He said that the dreams weren't guiding just Sira. If the other bearers were alive, they too could see this temple. They're heading north too. We need to leave a mark for them. Tain thought. Then he walked up to the temple wall. He placed his palm against it. He closed his eyes. He concentrated. Heat passed through his hand and flowed out through his fingers. Subtle, controlled. A scorched palm print remained on the stone. Clear, hot, radiating warmth. Tain turned to Sira. She understood. She stepped forward. She placed her palm next to his. A chill ran through her fingers. A second imprint remained on the stone, covered with a thin layer of eternal frost. 2 signs: fire and ice. Any carrier would sense them from 100 meters away and follow. They left the temple at dawn. Hagrin led the way. Tane followed him. Sira brought up the rear. She moved silently, lighter than Tane, lighter than Hagrin, as if gliding over the stones. Tane kept glancing back at her. Every time he caught her gaze, she quickly looked away. So did he. Hagrin pretended not to notice. 2 days' journey along the ridge. Little water, even less food. Hagrin set snares, caught 2 rabbits. Tane started a fire, his own. Not from his mouth, from his palm. This was new. He'd discovered it by accident. He'd wanted to light some twigs and held out his hand. A flame came out of the center of his palm. Small, steady, like a candle. Hagrin dropped his flask. Sira took a step back. Tane hadn't expected it himself. He looked at the little flame on his hand. It didn't burn. It didn't hurt. It just burned. His own fire. Obedient. He turned his hand. The flame turned with it. He tilted his palm. The flame flowed like liquid and set the branches alight. Tane closed his palm. The fire went out. He looked at his skin. No burn marks. The scales on his hand gleamed as if polished. Hagrin had said that Caragor could smelt metal with his bare hands, melt stone, cut through a mountain with a stream of fire like a knife cuts through butter. Tane was at the first step of that path. On the second day, they came to a fork in the trail. The path split. One led north into the mountains, the other down into the valley. Hagrin said they needed to go into the mountains. Tane stopped. He sensed something. Down below. In the valley. Warmth. Alive. Not human. He stood with his eyes closed, listening to his instincts. Small. Faint. Frightened. Far away. About 10 kilometers to the southeast. But distinct. Like a candle in the dark. He opened his eyes. Told Hagrin there was someone down there. A carrier. Small. Sira approached, closed her eyes, stood there for a long time, then nodded. She felt it too. The cold recognized the warmth of foreign blood. Hagrin cursed. The valley meant people. Roads. Villages. Patrols. Everything they were running from. Tane said he wouldn't leave the carrier alone. Hagrin looked at him, saw the look on his face, stopped arguing. They went down into the valley by evening. They walked in single file, through the forest and ravines. Tane led the way. He followed the heat like a beacon. With every kilometer, the signal grew stronger and more desperate. Someone down there was afraid, very much so. At the edge of the village, they lay low in the bushes. A small village, 20 houses, a square, a well, an inn, and horses, a lot of them, tied up by the inn. 2 had silver saddlecloths. Silver. Here. Tane clenched his teeth. Heat surged into his chest. He held his breath. 3 seconds. He exhaled through his nose. No smoke. Control. He looked around. His instincts led him to a house on the outskirts. Small. Crooked. The door was closed. The windows were dark. But inside it was warm. A green warmth. Bright. Alive. Frightened. Tane whispered to Hagrin that the carrier was in that house. Hagrin nodded. He said the hunters were at the inn. At least 2, maybe more. If they knew about the carrier in the house, it meant they were waiting for morning. They'd execute him in front of witnesses. That's what the order does, to set an example. so others would be afraid. Tane asked how long until dawn. Hagrin replied, 3 hours. Tane said that would be enough. Hagrin looked at him and asked what it would be enough for. Tane didn't answer. He was already crawling toward the house. Tane crawled through the vegetable garden toward the back wall of the house. The ground was wet from the rain. Cabbage and onions. The smell of manure. He moved on his elbows and knees, slowly, quietly. The scales on his hands caught on the leaves, but he pressed his sleeves down and crawled on. 3 meters to the wall. 2. 1. He pressed his back against the boards and froze. He listened. Inside the house, silence. But the heat burned brightly. Alive, green, small, a child. Tane circled the house, the back door, locked from the outside with a bolt. Rough. A plank in iron staples. He grabbed the plank and pulled. His muscles tensed. The iron creaked. The staples came out of the wood like nails from clay. He set the bolt down on the ground. Opened the door. Darkness. The smell of straw and urine. A small room. Just one. A table, a chair. Straw in the corner. A child was sitting on the straw. A boy, about 8 or 9 years old. Small, skinny, eyes huge, dark, wet. He was pressing his hands to his chest. His hands were green, not from paint. The skin on his fingers and palms had a greenish tint, like a young leaf. The boy saw Teen and pressed himself against the wall. He opened his mouth to scream. Teen raised his hand, palm out. He showed his scales. Scarlet, glistening in the moonlight. The boy froze. He looked at the hand, at the scales, then at Teen's face. Teen whispered that he was just like him, that he had come to take him away, that they had to go quietly. The boy didn't move. Tane crouched down. He held out his hand. The boy watched. Then he slowly stretched out his green palm and touched Tane's hand. Warm. Different. Not fire, not ice. Something alive. Growing. Like a root pushing through stone. The boy shuddered. He felt Tane's warmth in return, his fire, and he relaxed. His shoulders dropped. His eyes were still wet, but the fear was gone. Tane picked him up. The boy wrapped his arms around his neck. Light. Weightless. Bones beneath the skin. He hadn't been fed for at least 2 days. Tane went out the back door, walked through the garden, dived into the bushes. Hagrin was waiting. Sira, too. She saw the boy and her face twitched. The first real emotion Tane had seen in her. Not cold, not caution. Pain. The boy looked at Sira, at the steam coming from her mouth, at the frost on her fingers, and clung tighter to Tane. Tane whispered that she was one of them, that she was just like them. The boy wouldn't let go. Hagrin gestured for them to leave. They set off through the forest along the edge of the village. Tane carried the boy. Sarah walked ahead. Hagrin brought up the rear. 50 meters to the forest. 40. 30. The tavern door slammed. Tane froze. He turned around. A man stepped out onto the square. Tall, in a silver cloak, hood thrown back, a sword at his belt. He was walking toward the well, to draw water or relieve himself. A hunter. He wasn't looking their way, but he was walking parallel to them, and if he turned his head to the left, he would see 3 figures in the bushes. Tane crouched lower. The boy was silent. He clung to his neck. The hunter reached the well. He scooped up water with a bucket. He drank. He wiped his lips. He stood there for a moment. He looked at the stars. He turned around. He walked back. He didn't turn his head. He didn't see them. Tane counted to 20. He moved on. 20 meters to the forest. 10. 5. They entered the woods. Tane exhaled. But he didn't stop. They walked for another 2 hours in the dark. Tane could see in the dark like a cat. He led the others. The boy had fallen asleep in his arms. He was breathing quietly and evenly. His green hands glowed with a faint shimmer in the dark. By dawn, they were already in the foothills, far from the village. Hagrin found a cave among the rocks. They squeezed inside. Tane laid the boy on his cloak. The boy woke up. He looked around. He saw Tane, Sira, Hagrin. He wasn't scared. He said his name was Orin, that he was 9, that his mother had died a year ago, that he'd been living with his aunt in the village, that his aunt was kind, until the green appeared on his hands. His aunt saw it, and the next day the silver ones were in the village. Tane asked what he could do. Orin didn't understand. Tane held out his palm and released a small tongue of flame. Orin stared with his mouth open. Then he looked at his hands. He placed his palms on the stone. Tane waited. A minute later, a sprout emerged from a crack in the stone. Green, thin. It grew right before his eyes. 5 seconds later, it was already a stem as tall as his palm, with a leaf. Orin removed his hands. The sprout stopped growing. But it didn't wither. Alive. Real. Green blood. Life. A healer. Hagrin looked at the sprout, then at the boy, then at Tane. He said there hadn't been any greens for a very long time, that, according to the chronicles, the last green ancient was one of the first to die in the purge, because he refused to fight, because the greens didn't know how to kill, only to heal, only to grow, only to give life, and they killed him first because he didn't resist. Orin listened and didn't understand half of it. He was a child, a hungry, tired child with green hands whom his aunt had handed over to the people in silver cloaks. Sarah silently pulled the last piece of bread out of the bag. She held it out to Orin. He took it with both hands and began to eat, quickly, greedily. Crumbs fell onto her cloak. Sira watched him, and the look on her face made Tane's chest ache. Not heat, just pain. Human pain. They rested until noon. Then they set off toward the Grey Ridge. Tane carried Orin on his back. The boy clung to his shoulders. His fingers dug into the fabric. Through his shirt, Tane could feel the boy's green warmth touching his scales. A strange sensation, like if grass were growing on stone. Something alive on something hard. By evening, they had climbed to the first ridge of the Grey Range. Hagrin pointed to a dark gap in the rock, the entrance to a cave. Wide, about 3 meters. It was dark inside. Air was flowing out from within, warm. So the cave was deep. Tane lit a fire in his palm and went in first. The cave stretched deep into the mountain. The ceiling was high. The walls were smooth. Not natural. Carved. Someone had carved this cave out of the rock. Long ago. A very long time ago. There were chisel marks on the walls. And drawings. Tane raised his hand higher. The fire illuminated the wall. A dragon. Scarlet. Huge. Drawn in ochre and blood. Others nearby. White. Green. Black. It was a lair. The ancient lair of the ancients. Hagrin whistled softly. Sarah approached the wall and touched the drawing of the white dragon. Her fingers left a frosty trail on the stone. Orin slid down from Tane's back, standing and looked around. His green hands glowed brighter, as if the place was responding to his blood, as if the mountain had recognized its own. Tane walked on. The cave widened. A hall. Huge, with columns of stalagmites, with an underground stream, with niches in the walls where those the size of a house once slept. He stopped in the middle of the hall. The fire in his palm burned steadily. Tane raised his hand and the flame shot up toward the ceiling. The stone flared with a red light. For a moment, the entire hall became visible. Hundreds of meters, dozens of niches, a stream, a lake in the depths, and silence. The heavy, ancient silence of a place that had waited 400 years. Teen lowered his hand. He turned to the others. He said they would stay here. Hagrin asked how long. Teen replied that they would stay until they were ready. A month in the caves. 30 days without daylight. Teen went outside only at night. He checked the surroundings. He listened to the mountains. He sniffed the wind. Then he returned. Inside, they set up camp in the main hall. Hagrin gathered kindling for a regular fire. Teen could have lit the hall with his own flame, but that would have hastened his awakening. Every burst of fire was another step toward becoming a dragon, and a step away from being human. He tried to conserve his power. He used it only during training. Fire in the morning. In the evening, reading the scrolls he'd taken from the temple. In between, stick fighting with Hagrin. The old man didn't go easy on him. He hit hard, precisely. Teen learned quickly. The blood spurred his body on. Reflexes that take an ordinary warrior years to develop appeared in him within days. Hagrin said it wasn't fair. Tain replied that fairness was a luxury for those who weren't meant to be killed. Sarah trained separately. She went to the far end of the cave. Tain could hear her breathing, how the air crackled with cold, how ice covered the walls. She progressed more slowly than he did, but more steadily, without outbursts, without losing control. Her power was different. Not an explosion, but pressure, a slow buildup of cold, like winter. It doesn't come in a day, but when it comes, it doesn't retreat. On the 10th day, Sira showed Tain what she had learned. She stepped into the middle of the hall, stretched out her arms, closed her eyes. The air around her thickened. The temperature dropped. Tain felt the heat in his chest recede, instinctively straining to compensate for the cold. A stream came out of Sira's mouth. Not steam, frost. A visible, tangible stream of... It struck the cave wall. The stone was covered with a layer of ice a finger's width thick. Instantly. Sarah lowered her arms. She looked at the result, then at Tain. He nodded. She didn't smile. But there was something resembling satisfaction in her eyes. Oren was changing too. The green on his hands spread up to his elbows. The boy couldn't control the power. It came out on its own. When he slept, grass sprouted through the stone around his bedding. Tiny stems and flowers, in complete darkness, without soil or water, just life, stubborn and inexplicable. Hagrin found a wounded crow in the cave, a broken wing. He brought it to Oren, said, "Try." Oren took the bird in his hands. The crow twitched and cawed. The boy pressed it to his chest. He closed his eyes. His hands glowed green. Not brightly, softly, like light through the foliage. The raven fell silent. A minute later, Oren opened his eyes. He let the bird go. It spread its wing, both wings. It cawed. It flew up. It circled under the cave ceiling and flew out the exit. Oren looked at his hands, then at Tain. Tain sat down next to him. He said he was a healer, that this power wasn't for fighting. It was for bringing life back. Oren asked if that meant he wouldn't fight. Tain replied that he would stay behind those who were fighting, and that this was the most important place in battle, because without a healer, the wounded die, but with him, they don't. Oren nodded, small, serious, mature beyond his years, like all children whom the world had kicked out too soon. On the 17th day, Tain's senses picked up a new signal, distant, from the south. Not warm, not cold. Dark, like a hole in the fabric, like a shadow you feel with your skin rather than your eyes. Tain told Hagrin. The old man frowned. asked what it was like. Tane thought, then replied that it was like fire turned inside out. Not heat, but emptiness. Hagrid paled, said that black blood, darkness, the rarest and most dangerous type. From the Order's chronicles, he knew of 2 black ancients. Both were killed on the first day of the Purge, before the rest, because they were feared more than anyone else. The black ones did not burn or freeze. They extinguished. Light, life, will. Near a black ancient, torches went out. People lost their strength. Steel rusted in its sheath. The signal was approaching, closer every day. Tane could feel it moving. Not along the road, through the forest, through the mountains, in a straight line, like a shadow that never stops. On the 20th day, the signal was already at the foot of the ridge. Tane went out at dawn and stood at the entrance to the cave. He waited. An hour later, a figure emerged from the forest on the slope. Tall, thin, dressed in black. A hood. Under the hood, a face. Young. A guy. About 20, maybe a little older. Dark eyes. Sunken cheeks. 3-day stubble. He walked steadily, not in a hurry. He saw Tane. Stopped. They looked at each other. Tane sensed him like a void that sucked the warmth out of the air. Being near this guy made him want to back away. Not out of fear, out of instinct, like a hand pulling away from something hot. Only the opposite, from something cold. No, not even from something cold, from something empty. The guy spoke first. He said he was on his way to their signal, to the imprints in the temple, that he'd sensed them from hundreds of kilometers away, that his name was Kuin, that he was from the eastern swamps, that his mother was a whore and his father was a nobody, that a year ago the shadows around him had come to life, that he'd run away before they could turn him in, and that he wasn't sure why he'd come. Tane asked then, why? Kuin paused. Then he answered that it was because he had nowhere else to go. Tane nodded. He said that was enough. He turned and walked into the cave. Kuin stood there for another minute. Then he followed. Inside, Sira saw him and stepped back. Orin hid behind a rock. Hagrid put his hand on his sword. Kuin stopped. He looked at each of them. Tane said that Kuin was with them. Hagrid didn't take his hand off his sword. He said that black blood was a problem, that the black ancients were unpredictable, that even the other dragons didn't fully trust them. Kuin gave a wry smile. He said he was used to it. Tane stepped between them. He told Hagrid that there were few of them left, too few to be picky, that Kuin had come because he had nowhere else to go, and that made him one of them. Hagrid slowly lowered his hand, but he didn't take his eyes off Kuin. The first few days were tense. Kuin kept to himself. He slept in a far alcove, alone. He didn't eat with the others. He didn't train. He sat in the dark and said nothing. Tane didn't pressure him. He waited. On the third day, Kuin went out to the underground lake. Tane was there. He was training fire over the water. A jet of flame reflected on the surface. Kuin watched. Then he reached out toward the water. The shadow of his palm fell on the surface and sank. Not a reflection. The shadow entered the water like ink. It spread out, a black spot in the clear water. The fish swimming near the shore darted away. Kuin withdrew his hand. The shadow dissipated. The water became clear. He looked at Tyne. Tyne looked at him. He said it was impressive. Kuin snorted. He said it was an abomination. Tyne shook his head. He said that what they'd done to their people was the abomination. And power was just power. It depends on who holds it. Kuan was silent for a long time. Then he nodded. After that, he walked out to the communal fire. He sat at the edge. He didn't speak, but he was there. The four of them. Fire, ice, life, darkness. Four bearers in an ancient lair beneath the mountain. Tyne stood on the clearing in front of the cave and looked at the stars. Scales covered his torso completely, his arms down to his wrists. It was beginning to climb up his neck. He ran a finger along his throat. Smooth plates, warm, his own. He had been counting. By his calculations, there were perhaps 6 months left until full awakening. Maybe a year. It depended on how much power he used. Every burst of fire brought the end of the man and the beginning of the dragon closer. He looked at his hands, at the crimson scales, at the human fingers sticking out from beneath the plates. Half one thing, half another. He thought of his mother, of how she taught him not to get angry, not to clench his fists, not to stand out. She knew that every surge of emotion was a step toward awakening. She was stalling. 16 years. He looked at the stars. He inhaled the night air, exhaled. No smoke. Clean. They had lived in the caves for 3 months, 90 days. Tane kept track with notches on the wall. A new notch every morning. A check in the shard of a mirror every morning. The scales on his neck had reached his chin. His cheekbones had become slightly more angular. His pupils had changed. They had elongated vertically. Not quite like a snake's, but no longer like a human's. He could hide the scales with clothing. A high collar, gloves. But he couldn't hide his eyes. From that day on, he avoided crowded places. Hagrin went to the village alone. Once a week. He bought food. He listened to the news. The news was bad. The Order of the Silver Spear had pulled 7 detachments toward the mountains. A full mobilization, the likes of which hadn't been seen in 20 years. Master Alaric had personally arrived from the capital at the border fort. This was serious. Alaric hadn't left Averon in years. His presence meant that the Order no longer considered Tane a minor problem. He had become a threat. Even worse. The elves had sent an embassy to the king. For the first time in half a century. The elves had been the chief architects of the purge 400 years ago. Their mages created spells that pierced dragon scales. Their archers shot arrows made from the bones of the ancients. If the elves were forming a new coalition, it meant panic had reaching the eternal forest. Hagrin told this story that evening by the campfire. Everyone listened. Kuan sat in the shadows. His face was expressionless. Sira sat next to Teen, close. Their shoulders were almost touching. Heat and cold, steam between them. Orin lay next to the fire. Around him, as always, grass had sprouted through the stone. He no longer noticed it. Teen listened and thought. 7 squads, at least 20 fighters each, 140 trained hunters, plus Alaric with his personal guard, plus the elven mages if the coalition goes through, against 4 of them, 1 a child, 1 an old man, and 2 half-awakened. The math isn't in their favor. Teen stood up. He walked across the hall. He stopped by the wall with the drawings. Ancient dragons. Scarlet, white, green, black. Once there were hundreds of them. They lived in these caves, flew over the ridge, slept in niches carved into the stone. And then people came, with spears made of dragon bone, and wiped them out. Tane placed his palm on the drawing of the scarlet dragon. The stone beneath his hand grew warm. He closed his eyes. The memory of blood responded. A waking dream, a flash. He stood in this hall. But the hall was full. Dozens of the ancients in human forms, and dozens in their true forms. huge, scarlet, white, green. They spoke, argued, growled. One of them rose above the rest, black, huge, larger than all the others, wings like sails. He roared, and the others fell silent. A council. Tane understood. It was the council of the ancients. Here, in this hall, once upon a time. The vision faded. Tane opened his eyes. His palm had left a scorched imprint on the stone. Another one. He turned to the others, said they had to act, that hiding any longer was pointless. The Order would find the caves. It was only a matter of time. They had to either flee beyond Arad or stand up and make their presence known. Hagrin asked what he meant. Tane replied that the chronicles and the scrolls all said the same thing. The dragons had been destroyed because they were divided. The Council of 7 Kings had broken them down, one by one. Bribed, deceived, pitted them against each other. The ancients didn't believe humans would attack. Not all fought. Many fled. Many simply surrendered. And every one of them was killed. Tane said he wouldn't repeat that mistake, that they wouldn't hide and they wouldn't run, that they would come out and show the world that the ancients hadn't been wiped out. Kuin asked how exactly. His voice was dry, emotionless. Tane replied that, to start with, they needed the truth. Not the version that had been drummed into their heads for 400 years, but the real one. The one recorded within these walls and these scrolls. The dragons did not attack first. The Council of 7 Kings began the purge to seize the power of dragon blood. The Order of the Silver Spear was created not to protect people, but for systematic extermination. This was not a war. It was a massacre. Sarah asked who would believe them. Tane replied that not everyone would, but some would. He recalled what Hagrin had told him. Princess Eileen, the king's daughter. She had been secretly collecting records about the purge. Her great-grandmother had kept a diary. Eileen knew that the official history was a lie. If they could establish a connection with her, someone in a position of power would emerge who could speak out. Hagrin shook his head. He said that getting to the princess would be suicide. She in Averon, the capital, the Order's citadel, thousands of soldiers, walls, mages. Tane replied that not now. First, they needed to get stronger. We need time. But he had set the course. Not flight, not war, the truth. The coming weeks would determine the direction. Tane began to plan. Training by day, strategy by night. He laid out on a rock a rough map drawn in charcoal. Hagrin helped. He pointed out the locations of the Order's forts, patrol routes, weak spots. Sarah turned out to be a good strategist, a cool head. She saw the map as a chessboard. Kuin listened and said nothing. Then, suddenly, he would say something in a single sentence, and that sentence would change the whole situation. He didn't think like a warrior, like a thief, like a spy. He saw cracks where others saw walls. At the end of the 3rd month, Hagrin returned from the village earlier than usual. His face was pale. His hands were shaking. He said there was a silver squad in the valley. Not a regular patrol. A punitive squad. 50 fighters. They had a local guide with them. They were heading for the ridge, combing through the caves one by one. Someone had seen a light in the mountains. Someone had heard a roar. Not a roar, a burst of flame. Tane had been training too loudly. The sound had traveled through the stone and reached the outside. Someone had heard it. Tane clenched his teeth. His mistake. He looked at the others. Orin pressed himself against Sira. Kuin stood by the wall, his face blank. Hagrin held his sword. Tane said there were 2 options. Run through the far exit of the cave, if it exists, or face the squad here. Hagrin said that 50 Order fighters weren't some village militia. These were people who'd been trained to kill carriers since childhood. Tane replied that he knew. Kuan said there was a third option. Everyone looked at him. Kuan said that darkness didn't just extinguish light, it hid things. He could shroud the cave entrance in such darkness that it couldn't be found. They won't see. They won't smell. Not even if they're standing a meter away. Tane asked how long it would last. Kuan shrugged. He said he hadn't tried it. Maybe an hour? Maybe a day. Maybe longer. It depends on how far he's willing to let the blood flow. Tane understood. The same limitation. Every use of the power hastens the awakening. For Kuan, this means that the darkness devours what remains of the man. He looked at Kuan. Kuan looked at him. He asked, "Well, what?" Tane said, "Do it." Kuan walked to the entrance. He stood in the doorway. He raised his hands. Shadows from the walls reached out toward him, alive, thick. They flowed down the stone like black water. They flowed around his legs, climbed up his body. Kuan exhaled. Darkness poured out of him, like ink into water. It filled the entrance, thickened, became impenetrable. A wall of darkness. Neither light nor sound nor scent passed through it. Inside, the cave became completely dark. Tane lit a fire in his palm, small, cautious. Their faces lit up. Hagrin was pale. Sarah was calm. Oren, with wide eyes, clung to her hand. Kuan stood at the entrance, motionless, his hands hanging down, eyes closed. Around him, the darkness pulsed as if alive. They waited. Tane counted the minutes. 10, 20, 30. An hour later, he heard it. Footsteps outside. Voices, muffled. Many. The clang of metal. Someone passed a meter from the entrance. Tane heard breathing, heard a heartbeat. Fast, alert. The hunter stopped at the entrance, stood there. Tane held his breath. The hunter stood there a little longer, then moved on. The voices receded. The footsteps faded. Tane waited another hour. Silence. He looked at Kuan. The boy stood motionless. Sweat was streaming down his face. Black, not ordinary. Thick and dark. The skin around his eyes had darkened. Thin black lines had appeared on his temples, like veins filled with darkness. The price. Every minute of this wall cost him a piece of his humanity. Tane approached. He touched Kuan on the shoulder. He said it was enough, that they were gone. Kuan opened his eyes. Black. Completely. No whites. 2 voids. Then he blinked. The whites returned. His pupils narrowed. Normal eyes. Almost. The darkness at the entrance dissipated like smoke. Light burst into the cave. Kuan staggered. Tane caught him, sat him down on a rock. Oren ran over. He placed his green hands on Kuan's shoulders. Tane saw green light flow through the dark veins on Kuan's temples. As the darkness receded, slowly, Oren strained. His face was wet with sweat. The green on his hands pulsed. 5 minutes later, Kuan exhaled. His complexion returned to normal. The veins disappeared. He looked at Oren, then at his own hands, then at Tane. He said nothing, but for the first time ever, something other than emptiness appeared in his eyes. Surprise, and perhaps gratitude. Oren fell to his knees, exhausted. Sira caught him. Kuan looked at the boy. Then he quietly said thank you. The first word he had spoken not out of necessity, but of his own accord. Tane stood and watched them, the 4 of them. Fire, ice, life, darkness. They had just worked together for the first time, not in training, for real. And they had survived. After the punitive squad left, they couldn't stay. Hagrin said the hunters would return. They would comb the ridge again, more thoroughly, with dogs, with mages if the elves send reinforcements. They had to move. Tane agreed, but not north, not further into the mountains. South, to the people. Hagrin looked at him as if he were crazy. Tane explained. They could run through the mountains for another year, 2, 10, and every time the Order will be closer. The Order has resources, money, people, informants in every village. They have 4 of them and 1 old man. Sooner or later, they'll be cornered in the mountains. So we need to change the rules. Sira asked how exactly. Tane said they needed allies, not carriers. People. Ordinary people who would question the Order, who would ask questions, who would stop believing that everyone with dragon blood is a monster. And for that to happen, someone had to see them. Alive. Not as monsters from fairy tales, but as people. Like a 16-year-old boy. Like a girl. Like a 9-year-old child. Kuin said it sounded like suicide. Tyne replied that running away was suicide too. Just a slow one. They argued for 2 days. Hagrin was against it. Sarah was in favor. Kuin was silent. Orin didn't vote because he'd fallen asleep by the fire. In the end, they agreed on a compromise. Not to go to the city. Not to give up. But to stop hiding completely. To head south. To seek out those who were uncertain. To start small. With villages. With taverns. With people on the roads. To show that the bearers don't burn villages or devour babies. That they simply want to live. They emerged from the caves at dawn on the 4th day. Tyne led the way. A hooded cloak. Gloves. A high collar. His eyes were a problem. His vertical pupils stood out in any light. Sarah made up her mind. She found a bandage in Hagrin's bag. Dark cloth. She made a blindfold. She wrapped it around Tane's eyes. She said he was a blind traveler. His uncle was leading him. Tane could see through the cloth. His dragon vision pierced the blindfold like paper. But to those around him, he was blind. Hagrin led him by the elbow. Sira walked beside them. Kuin kept his distance. Orin rode on Tane's back. They looked like a group of vagabonds, beggar travelers. Thousands like them roamed the roads of Erid. No one would look twice. They passed the first village without stopping. The second, too. In the third, Hagrin went into an inn for food. He returned with news. The Order had announced a second bounty. Not for information, for the head. 500 gold crowns. For the carrier, dead or alive. Anyone. Tane clenched his teeth. A heat surged in his chest. He held it back. 500 crowns for a head. Every person they met was a potential executioner. They bypassed large villages and stuck to country roads. A week later, they reached the Siren River. Wide, deep, the main waterway of central Erad. Trade barges traveled along it. Fishing villages stood on the banks. The bridges were guarded. Finding a crossing wasn't easy. Hagrin knew a spot. An old ford further upstream. Shallow, waist-deep. But the current was strong. They crossed at night. Tane carried Orin on his shoulders. The boy clung to his neck. The water was freezing. For everyone except Sarah. She walked across the river, and the water around her was covered with a thin film of ice. Involuntarily. She didn't have full control yet. On the other side, the landscape was different. No mountains. Hills. Fields. Mixed forests. Wider roads. More villages. People closer. More dangerous. They walked for 3 more days. On the 4th, they stumbled upon a burnt-out village. A village. A dozen or so houses. All burned down. Not completely. The walls were still standing. The roofs had collapsed. The smell of smoke. Fresh. 2 days at most. Tane took off his bandage. He looked around. Not military destruction, not a siege. The fire had started from the inside, from one house. It spread to the neighboring ones. Hagrin found tracks, heavy boots, silver horseshoes on the heels. The silver ones had been here. Tane entered the house where the fire had started. The walls were black. The ceiling had collapsed. In the center of the room, the floor was melted. The stone was melted. This wasn't an ordinary fire. It was a dragon's. Someone had awakened here, and couldn't contain it. Just like he himself in Haven, only worse. Tane crouched down. He ran his hand over the melted stone. His instincts were silent. No heat, no signal. The carrier wasn't here, not anymore. Either they'd taken him away, or killed him. Hagrin found the answer beyond the village, in a field, a pillar, a plaque on the pillar. The text stated that, by the decree of the Order of the Silver Spear, a carrier of corruption named Fane had been executed here. 12 years old. Executed by beheading. The body burned, the ashes scattered. May the light protect our lands from the winged darkness. Tane stood before the post, 12 years old, a child, a year older than Orin. Heat burst from his chest. His fingers burned. The scales on his hands grew so hot that his gloves began to smoke. He pulled them off, threw them away, clenched his fists. His mother had told him not to clench his fists. He clenched them. His nails dug into his palms. Smoke rose from beneath his nails. Sira approached, stood beside him, said nothing, just stood there. A chill emanated from her. It flowed around Tane. It cooled him. Not completely, but enough for him to unclench his fists. Orin stood to the side. He looked at the post. His lips trembled. He understood that he could have been on that post. He should have been there. If Tane hadn't come to the village that night. Kuin approached the post, silently. He placed his palm on the wood. The shadow of his hand crept up the post, like black ivy. It wrapped around the plaque. The wood beneath his hand turned black. It darkened, and began to rot, in seconds. The post crumbled. The plaque fell into the grass, turned to dust. Kuin removed his hand, turned and walked back toward the road. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Tane stood there for another minute. Then he put on his gloves, a blindfold, and walked away. One thought in his head. Fine. 12 years. The 15th executed carrier in 50 years. Tane remembered that number. 15. They walked for 2 more days. On the 3rd day, they set up camp in the woods by the road. Hagrin went to the nearest village for supplies. He returned quickly. His face looked strange, not frightened, surprised. He said that people in the village were talking about something strange, that something unusual was happening. People had heard rumors about bearers living freely, about the 4 from the mountains, about a guy who breathes fire and a girl who gives off a chill. One of the hunters had let it slip, or maybe someone from the village where they'd taken Orin had told them. The rumor had spread. People passed it on by word of mouth, and the reaction wasn't what the Order had expected. Not fear, curiosity. Some said that if the bearers had wanted to kill, they would have already done so. But they'd just left, taken the child and left. They hadn't touched anyone. Tane listened. For the first time in months, something resembling hope stirred inside him. Not heat, not fire. Warm and human. He asked Hagrin what else people were saying. Hagrin replied that they were saying different things. Some believed the bearers were a curse. Others that the Order had grown too powerful and was executing children for rewards. Still others remained silent, waiting to see how it would end. But the main thing, a rift had begun, not among the people, within the Order itself. Hagrin had heard from the innkeeper that 2 Knights of the Silver Spear had refused to go on a punitive raid against the children. They had been arrested. It hadn't been made public, but such things seep out. When the Order starts arresting its own, it means there's a crack inside. A small one, but a crack. Tane looked at the others. Sira was listening. Her face was calm. Kuan looked interested for the first time. Oren was asleep. Tane said that this was the beginning, that rumors were a weapon, that people needed to see the truth, and that he knew how to speed it up. Tane's plan was simple: to go not away from the people, but toward them, not to hide, but to show, not to tell, but to do. He arranged the first test 4 days later, the village of Milheim, 30 houses by the river, a mill, a smithy, a market on Thursdays, and a problem. After the rains, the river had burst its banks. It flooded the lower fields. The harvest was rotting. The bridge had been washed away. The village was cut off from the trade route. Teen learned this from Hagrin, who had gone on a reconnaissance mission. They arrived at night. Teen took off his blindfold. He surveyed the river. The flood was wide. 20 meters of murky water covered the fields. The bridge lay in a heap of logs on the bank. The current was still strong. Teen looked at the river, then at Sarah. She understood. They went down to the river together. Teen stood on the bank, Sarah beside him. He placed his hand on the water. Heat. The water hissed. Steam rose in a column. Sarah placed her hand beside his. Cold. The water froze. They worked for 2 hours. Teen evaporated the water from the fields. Slowly, layer by layer, steam rose into the night sky. Sarah froze the banks. She reinforced them. She kept the water from returning. By dawn, the fields were clear. Wet but clear. The water had returned to its channel. The banks were reinforced by a strip of ice that would take a week to melt. Enough time for the villagers to build a new dam. Oren walked across the field and placed his hands on the wet earth. A green light seeped into the soil. An hour later, the wheat sprouts that were supposed to have rotted straightened up, came to life, rose up. A small miracle. They were gone before the village woke up, but traces remained. Ice on the banks, scorched steam on the rocks, revived fields, and footprints on the ground. Large, heavy, with scales that had pressed into the mud. In the morning, the villagers came out and saw the river in its bed, the fields saved, the wheat growing, ice on the banks, and the tracks, inhuman tracks. 2 days later, throughout the southern county, people were talking about the miracle in Milheim. Some said the spirit of the river had come. Others said a mage from the capital. But the blacksmith of Milheim found a scale in the mud, scarlet, hard as steel, warm, and they stopped keeping quiet. A dragon. A dragon came at night and saved the village. Didn't burn it down, saved it. Teen heard about it from Hagrin, and for the first time, he allowed himself to think that the plan might work. A week later, a second village, Krenwood, lumberjacks. A different problem. A pack of wolves, 20 of them, came from the north, killed the livestock, bit 2 children. There are no hunters in the village. Everyone left to find work in the city. Teen came at night, alone, without Hagrin, without the others. Found the pack by scent. 22 wolves, hungry, angry. The leader was huge, gray with a black stripe down its spine. Teen stepped out to face them. He took off his headband. He took off his gloves. He took off his cloak. He stood before the pack in his shirt. Scales glinted on his arms and neck in the moonlight. His eyes burned orange, vertical pupils. The wolves froze. The alpha bared its teeth. It growled. Teen opened his mouth. Not fire, sound, a roar. A low, guttural, inhuman roar. The roar of a dragon. The earth vibrated. Leaves rained down from the trees. The wolves crouched, tucked their tails. The alpha stood there for 3 seconds, then turned and ran, the pack behind him. A minute later, The wolves deserted. Tane stood there, trembling, not from the cold, from the power that had coursed through him. The roar was not just a sound. It came from his core, from the place where his inner fire burned. It was the voice of the Ancient One, the voice of Karagor. His body remembered that sound. His throat knew how to produce it. The memory of blood. He pulled on his cloak, his headband, his gloves. He left. In the morning, the lumberjacks found tracks, wolf tracks heading north, and a single trail of footprints, human but with scales imprinted on them. Rumors spread. Village after village, week after week. Tane came at night, solved the problem, left. Didn't show his face, didn't speak, just acted. A bridge collapsed. The next morning, the stone supports were fused together by the heat. An epidemic among the livestock. The next morning, the animals were healthy, and in the trough was green water that healed their wounds. Bandits on the road. The next morning, the bandits were bound with black vines, shadows by the roadside. They trembled, they stuttered. They say something emerged from the darkness, and this something had no face. Kuin, his work. He didn't admit it, but he stopped saying he wasn't sure why he'd come. A month passed, then a second. Rumors turned into stories, stories into legend. A tale of 4 spirits circulated through the southern counties: the fiery one, the icy one, the green one, the black one. They come to those who are suffering. They help and then vanish. They kill no one. They burn no one. The order declared all the stories heresy. It forbade speaking of the spirits on pain of arrest. That was a mistake. When you forbid people from speaking of good, they start whispering about it. And whispers travel farther than shouts. People whispered in taverns. They whispered in the markets. They whispered in churches. People asked each other, if the bearers are monsters, why do they save villages? If dragon's blood is impure, why does it heal wounds? If the order is a protector, why does the order execute children? Questions that no one had asked for 400 years. Now they were being asked. Quietly, but they were being asked. And another piece of news reached Tane via Hagrin. From the capital, Princess Eileen had publicly questioned the execution of 12-year-old Fane at the royal council, in front of witnesses. She asked what threat the child posed. They did not answer her. Master Alaric demanded that the princess not interfere in the order's affairs. The king remained silent. Eileen did not back down. She began her own investigation, openly. Tane stood on the hill and looked south. Somewhere over the horizon lay the capital. Somewhere out there, a girl with her great-grandmother's diary was asking questions that could turn everything upside down. He clenched his fist. This time, not out of anger, out of determination. Standing nearby were Sarah and Kuin, and Hagrin with Orin on his shoulders. 5 on the hill, against the whole world. But the world was beginning to have doubts. 6 months had passed since leaving Haven. Tane stood before a stream in the forest and looked at his reflection. His face had changed. His cheekbones were sharper. His jaw was heavier. Scales had risen up his neck and reached his lower jaw. Along his hairline at his temples, thin plates extended upward. His eyes were entirely dragon-like, orange with vertical pupils. They glowed in the dark. His hands were covered in scales from his fingers to his shoulders. His nails had grown thicker and darker. Not claws yet, but no longer nails. He was 16. He looked 25. His body was growing faster than it should. His muscles were dense. He'd grown a hand's length in 6 months. His blood raced. Every day brought him closer to the dragon. Every day took him further from the boy from Haven. He turned away from the water. Hagrin was waiting on the shore. The old man looked worse with every passing week. His heart skipped beats more often. His knees were swollen. A cough in the mornings. 64 years old. 20 years in the mountains. Cheap alcohol and bad food and old wounds. His body was wearing out. Oren treated what he could. He placed his green hands on Hagren's chest. Green light flowed inside. Hagren breathed easier for a couple of days. But Oren couldn't turn back time. He treated the damage, not old age. Hagren knew. He didn't say anything. Teen knew. He didn't say anything either. They were moving southeast, toward the capital, slowly, carefully. Teen couldn't enter a single village. His appearance made it impossible. Even a bandage couldn't hide the scales on his jaw. He stayed in the forest. Hagren and Sarah went to see the people. Kuan would appear and disappear. He had learned to move through the shadows, literally. He would step into the shadow of a tree and emerge from the shadow of a house 100 meters away. It took a toll on him. Every time, black veins would show on his. Every time, Oren expended energy to pull him back. But Kuan didn't stop. He became the group's scout. Invisible, inaudible, everywhere and nowhere. The big news came through Kuan. He slipped into the shadow of a tavern wall in the city of Verent and overheard a conversation between two knights of the Order. They said that Master Alaric had recalled 3 detachments from the mountains. He had redirected them south. Alaric had understood Tain's strategy. He realized that the carrier's hiding but acting, and he decided to seize the initiative. The Order was preparing a show of force, a large raid on the southern villages. Search every house, interrogate every suspect, arrest anyone who tells stories about the 4 spirits. Alaric was banking on fear. If people couldn't fear dragons, then let them fear the Order. Tain listened to Kuan. He looked at the map drawn in charcoal. 3 detachments were advancing from the north. They're moving in a fan formation, combing through county by county. In a week, they'll be in the Verenta area. And it's a 2-day journey from Verenta to them. Sarah said they needed to head east, go around the raid, approach the capital from the other side. Hagren agreed. Kuan shrugged. He didn't care which way they went, as long as there were shadows. Tain was silent. He was thinking. 3 detachments, 60 fighters, moving through the villages, arresting people for their words, for stories told by the campfire, for whispers in the tavern. People who hadn't done anything, who had simply started asking questions. Tain said he wouldn't leave. Hagren asked what he had in mind. Tain replied that he would confront one of the squads, personally. Hagren cursed. Sarah turned pale. Kuan raised an eyebrow. Tain explained. If they run away, the raid will sweep through the villages. People will suffer. All their work over the past 2 months will go down the drain. The people who started to doubt will fall silent. The Order will demonstrate its power. Fear will return. We need to show that the Order isn't all-powerful, that there is someone who can stand between the Order and the people, not hide behind their backs, but stand at the front. Sira said it was madness. Tain replied that perhaps it was, but it was a necessary madness. They prepared for 3 days. Tain chose the spot, the road through the hills south of Verent, narrow, with a cliff on the right and a forest on the left, the perfect spot for an ambush. But Tain wasn't planning an ambush. He planned to stand on the road, alone, out in the open, and wait. Hagren objected vehemently. He said that 20 trained assassins against 1 half-awakened boy wasn't heroism, but foolishness. Tain replied that he wouldn't be alone, that Kuan would be in the shadows, Sira behind the hill, Hagren and Oren in the woods. If something went wrong, they would retreat. If it went right. Tain fell silent. Hagren asked what right meant. Tain replied that 20 knights would see him, alive, speaking. A man with scales, Not a monster from fairy tales, and some of them would think. Hagrid said that some of them would think about how to make 500 crowns. Tane replied that that was also possible. On the morning of the 4th day, Tane stood on the road, without a cloak, without a bandage, without gloves, in a simple shirt and pants. Scales glistened on his arms and neck. His eyes burned orange. He stood and waited. An hour later, dust appeared on the road. Then the sound of hooves. Then the riders. 22 of them. Silver cloaks, spears, swords. The commander in front, not young, about 40, a scar across his cheek. He saw Tane and raised his hand. The squad stopped. Silence. Only the horses snorted and shifted their hooves. The commander looked at Tane, at the scales, at the eyes. His face froze. He recognized what he was seeing. Tane stood and said nothing. He waited. The commander dismounted. He drew his sword. The others followed suit. 22 armed men against 1 on the road. Tane spoke. He said he didn't want to fight, that he had come to talk. The commander said he didn't talk to the Order's scum. Tane replied that his name was Tane, that he was 16 years old, that his mother was a herbalist from Haven, that 6 months ago he found out who his father was, and that ever since then people have been trying to kill him because of who he was born to be. The commander didn't answer, but he didn't attack either. He stood there and listened. Tane continued. He said he knew about the raid, that he knew the Order was coming to arrest people for their words, for telling stories. He asked since when the Order of the Silver Spear had been at war with the peasants. One of the knights behind the commander flinched, a young one, nervous. He lunged forward with his sword. Tane didn't move. A short jet of flame shot from his mouth, not at the knight, into the ground before him. The stone glowed red. The grass burst into flames. The line of fire crossed the road. The knight recoiled, fell, rolled back. His sword flew from his hand. The remaining 21 raised their weapons. Tane stood behind the line of fire, calm. He said he was repeating himself. He didn't want to fight, but if they stepped across the line, he couldn't promise they'd all return home. The commander looked at the line of fire, at the scorching stone, at the flame burning on its own on the bare earth, then at Tane. Then he turned to his men. He ordered them to lower their weapons. A young knight began to argue. The commander barked. The swords returned to their sheaths. The commander turned to Tane, said he was listening. Tane spoke for 10 minutes. He told him about Fane, the 12-year-old, the one who was executed, about the 14 children killed over 50 years, about the villages they had helped, about Oren, who is 9 years old and heals wounded birds. He asked if the boy who heals birds looks like a monster. The commander was silent. His face didn't change, but Tane saw. Dragon's sight, for the first time, truly, not just silhouettes and heat. He saw lies and truth. He saw the commander's heart beating, steady, but doubt in his eyes. Old, deep-seated, not sown by Tane. The commander had been doubting for a long time, perhaps ever since he carried out the first order he was ashamed of. Tane finished, turned, and walked away, with his back to 22 armed men. Every step could be his last. The scales on his back grew hot. His body was preparing. If an arrow or a spear flew into his back, he would turn and strike back. But he kept walking. 10 steps, 20, 30. No one fired. He entered the forest and vanished. 3 days after the encounter on the road, the world had changed. The squad commander returned to the fort. His name was Reagan. 15 years of service in the Order, an impeccable reputation. Reagan wrote a report. In the report, he stated that he had encountered a carrier, that the carrier had not attacked, that it had spoken, that it had behaved like a human, and that Regan was not certain that the execution of carriers was justified. The report reached Master Alaric that same day. Alaric read it. He summoned Regan. The conversation lasted an hour. No one knew what was said behind closed day. But Regan left the magister's office without his cloak, without his sword, without his rank, stripped of his rank, arrested, sent to the Citadel's dungeons. The formal charge: cowardice in the face of corruption. But a rumor spread through the forts and garrisons. Regan was no coward. Everyone knew that. Regan was one of the best. And if even he had doubts, then perhaps there was something to doubt. Kuin brought the news. He slipped through the shadows into the fort and back in a single night. His face was gray, black veins on his temples. Oren spent 3 hours bringing him back. But the information was worth it. Regan's arrest had split the garrison. 7 knights had submitted their resignations. They were denied. 2 left without permission. They were declared deserters. Hagrin listened and shook his head. He said that 20 years ago he had left alone. Now they leave in groups. The crack in the order has become a fault line. But Alaric had no intention of backing down. On the contrary, he doubled down. Hagrin learned from village rumors that the Magister had asked the king for wartime powers. The right to search any house without a warrant. The right to arrest without trial. The right to execute on the spot. The king hesitated. Princess Elaine spoke out against it at the council, openly, in front of the entire court. She said that wartime powers gave the order the authority of a tyrant, and that her father must not turn defenders into executioners. Alaric replied that the princess was young and did not understand the threat. That dragon blood was not a matter of politics, but a matter of survival. That 400 years ago, the world had nearly perished, and that he would not let it happen again. Elaine produced her great-grandmother's diary. She read aloud an entry from the day of the purge. The entry stated that the Council of 7 Kings had struck first, that the dragons had not attacked, that the purge was not a defense, but a conquest. The hall fell silent. Alaric turned pale. Then he said the diary was a forgery, that the princess had been misled, that the enemies of the crown were exploiting her naivety. The king ordered them both to be silent. The council ended in nothing. But the words had been spoken, in public, in front of witnesses, and they spread through the capital like wildfire. Tain found out about everything a week later. They were camped in the forest, 2 days' journey from Averon. Close. Dangerously close. But Tain wanted to be nearby. He wanted to feel the pulse of the capital. He stood at the edge of the forest and looked at the haze of the city beyond the fields. Sira approached. She stood beside him. They were silent. Then she said he had changed. Not just on the outside. He had started to think like a leader, like someone who leads others. Tain replied that he had no choice. Sira shook her head. She said there was always a choice. He could have left. Across the sea. To another continent. To live quietly. To hide until the end. Tain looked at her. He asked if she would have left. Sira was silent. Then she replied that no, she wouldn't. Because of Oren. Because of Fane. Because of 14 dead children. Because she couldn't. Tain nodded. They stood side by side, shoulder to shoulder, steam and smoke between them. That evening, for the first time, Sira sat next to him by the fire, not at a distance, but right up close. She rested her head on his shoulder. Her hair smelled of winter. His skin was hot as a stove, heat and cold. Oren slept nearby. Kuin sat in the shade by a tree. Hagrin was cleaning his sword. No one said a word. That night, Tain had a dream, not from the memory of blood, his own. He stood atop a mountain. Below him lay all of Ered. Cities, rivers, forests, fields, and people. Millions of people. He spread his wings. Not a half form, real ones. Huge, scarlet. A shadow covered the valley. The people below looked up. He waited for a scream, waited for terror. But the people watched. They just watched. Not all with joy, not all with fear. Most with something in between, with acceptance. He is here. He exists. He is neither a monster nor a god. He simply is. Tane woke up. His heart was steady. His fever was steady. His breath was clear. He knew what to do next. In the morning, he gathered everyone. He said it was time, that he would go to Averon, that he would find Elaine, that together they would uncover the truth. Hagrin asked how he planned to enter a city where every guard was looking for him. Tane looked at Quen. Quen looked at Tane. A long pause. Then Quen smiled. The first real smile. Not a crooked one. Not an empty one. He said he'd always wanted to see the capital. Quen led him through the night, literally. They stepped into the shadow of an old oak tree at the edge of the forest and emerged from the shadow of Averon's fortress wall. 200 kilometers in a single step. Tane felt the transition like a blow. Cold. Emptiness. A moment of absolute darkness in which there was neither top nor bottom. Then light. Moonlight. Dim. A wall. Stone. The smell of the city. Smoke. Filth. The sweat of thousands of people. Bread from the night bakeries. Quen stood nearby, pale as a corpse. Black veins covered his face from his temples to his chin. His eyes were completely black. He staggered. Tane caught him, sat him down in the shade by the wall. Quen was breathing heavily. He wheezed that 200 kilometers through the shadow was too much, that he needed an hour to rest. Or two. Tane nodded. Without Orin by his side, Quen was recovering more slowly. The dark veins on his face wouldn't fade. But Quen gritted his teeth and stood up after half an hour. He said he'd hold on. Averon was asleep. The city on 3 hills. The lower city, the merchant quarters, the artisan districts, the docks by the river. The middle city, noble mansions, guilds, courts, temples. The upper city, the royal palace, the order's citadel, barracks, walls within walls. Tane was wrapped from head to toe, a long cloak, a hood, gloves, boots, a blindfold. A blind beggar led by a companion, Quen in black, 2 ghosts in the night city. They moved through the back alleys of the lower city. Quen knew the shadows. He sensed them as Tane sensed fire. Every dark alley was a door to him, every unlit wall a hiding place. They glided through the city like oil on a warm frying pan, past the night patrols, past the guards at the crossroads, past the drunks at the taverns. No one saw them. Once, a patrol passed within 3 steps, 4 guards with torches. The light fell on the wall next to Tane. Quen twitched his fingers. The shadow from the wall thickened. It swallowed the light. The guards walked past. One turned around. He looked. He shrugged. He walked on. The approaches to the inner city were better guarded. A wall, a gate, guards. Quen led Tane to a section of the wall in the shadow of the tower. He placed his palm on the stone. The shadow spread across the wall. It formed an opening. Not a hole, an absence, a place where the wall wasn't, although it was there. Tane stepped through the shadow in the stone and found himself on the other side. Quen followed him. The opening closed. The wall became a wall. The middle city, wide streets, streetlights, mansions with coats of arms. There were more patrols here. The shadows were already here. They moved across the rooftops. Tane discovered he could jump. Far. High. His leg muscles sprang like steel cables. He flew from roof to roof. 4 meters. 5. Kuan couldn't do that. He moved through the shadows along the walls and appeared on the next roof, already waiting for Tane. The royal palace stood atop the central hill. White stone, spires, towers, walls 3 meters thick, guards at every gate, mages on the towers, protective spells. Kuan stopped on the roof of the nearest mansion. He said he wouldn't go any further. The spells on the palace walls dispel the darkness. Elven work. Ancient. Powerful. His power doesn't work there. Tane looked at the palace. His dragon's vision showed people inside. Dozens of guards. Servants. And deeper. On the 3rd floor of the north wing. A lone figure. Not sleeping. Sitting at a table. Reading. A candle is burning. A steady heartbeat. Calm. The heart of a person who is used to staying awake at night. Used to sitting with books. With notes. With diaries. Elaine. Tane asked Kuan if he could signal her. Kuan thought. Then he said that a shadow wouldn't pass through the spells, but sound would. Darkness can carry a whisper. Through walls, through stone, through spells, if the whisper is quiet enough. Quen closed his eyes. The black veins on his face pulsed. He whispered. The words faded into the darkness. Through the night air. Through the stone of the palace wall. Through the magic. Quiet. Almost inaudible. But they reached their destination. Tane watched with a dragon's vision. He saw the figure at the table freeze. Lift her head. Listen. Stand up. Walk to the window. Open it. Stand and listen to the night. Quen whispered. He said that the one she was looking for had come. That he was on the roof opposite the north wing. That he was asking for a single meeting. The figure at the window froze. Stood there for a long time. Then Tane saw her nod, slowly, and close the window. Quen opened his eyes. Said he was done. That he couldn't go on. He staggered. Tane caught him. Sat him down on the roof. Kuan was breathing heavily. He said he would wait here. That if Tane didn't return by dawn, he would leave and tell the others that the chief was an idiot. Tane nodded. He took off his cloak. He took off his headband. He took off his gloves. He stood at the edge of the roof in just a shirt. His scales glistened in the moonlight. His eyes burned. He looked at the palace. 30 meters of open space. Walls. Spells. Guards. He took a running start. He pushed off. He jumped. Our legs exploded with power. He soared. Not a flight. A leap. But so long and high that for a moment it seemed the air was holding him. 30 meters. Up. Forward. He flew over the wall. Through the spells that weren't designed for a physical body flying from above. Through the air smelling of stone and night-blooming flowers. And landed on the ledge of the 3rd floor of the north wing. Quietly. On scaly feet. Like a cat. The window in front of him was closed, but not locked. He pushed it. The pane opened. He entered. A room. Large. Books on the shelves. A table piled high with parchments. Candles. Maps. Notes. A leather-bound diary open in the middle. And a girl, standing by the table, facing the window. She was waiting for him. Tane saw her. Dark-haired, tall for a girl. Green eyes. A simple dress, not courtly. A work dress. Ink on her fingers. She looked at him. At his scales. At his eyes. At his hands. Without fear. With something he didn't immediately recognize. With interest. With the fierce, burning interest of a scientist who sees living proof of her theory. She said her name was Elaine. that she had been waiting for this moment for 2 years, ever since she read the diary. Tain said his name was Tain, that he was the son of Caragor the Red, that he was the last of the ancients. Eileen shook her head. She said she knew, that Alaric knew too, and that there were things none of them knew. She walked over to the table, opened a drawer, took out a scroll, an old one. A very old one, bearing the seal of the Council of 7 Kings. She said she'd found it in her father's archives, that it had been sealed for 400 years, that she'd broken the seal a week ago, and that what was written there changed everything. Tain took the scroll, unrolled it, the ancient language. He could read it. The text was short, an order. The Council of 7 Kings orders the launch of an operation to exterminate all ancient dragons within the territory of Ered. Rationale: the dragons refused to pass on to the Council the knowledge of the firstborn and the means to control it. The Council considers this an act of hostility. Special directive: begin the extermination with the green and peaceful ones. Leave the combat dragons for the final stage. Burn all eggs and nests. Leave no survivors. Rewrite history. Tain held the scroll. His hands did not tremble. The scales grew so hot that the parchment began to write at the edges. He carefully placed it on the table. He stepped back. He inhaled. He exhaled. Not through his mouth, through his nose. Control. He looked at Elaine. She stood and waited. He said he knew, from the scrolls in the temple, from the memory of blood. He knew the dragons hadn't started the war. But it's one thing to know. It's another to hold the order in his hands, an official one, with seals, with proof. Elaine nodded. She said this scroll could destroy the order, if the world saw it, if its authenticity were confirmed, if people believed it. Tain asked if Alaric knew about this scroll. Elaine replied that he did not, but he knows the truth. He's always known. He's a magister. The true history is passed down among the Order's magisters, from generation to generation, a secret. Alaric knows that the Purge was genocide, and he continues to execute the bearers, because he believes it is the only way to protect people from the firstborn. Without dragons, the firstborn sleeps longer. Dragon blood awakens him. More dragons mean a faster awakening. Tain froze. This was new information. He remembered the earth trembling in the mountains, tremors that grew stronger. He remembered the heat deep beneath the rock. Alien, ancient, vast. He looked at Elaine. She was looking at him. He asked if it was true. She replied that she didn't know, that there was a mention of the firstborn in his great-grandmother's diary, but there was no confirmation of a connection to dragon blood. It could be true, or it could be a lie the Order used to justify the killings. Tain nodded. He said he would find out, that he had the memory of blood, that his father knew about the firstborn, that the answer lay somewhere in his dreams. Elaine handed him the scroll. She told him to take it, that the original was more dangerous than the copy, that if Alaric found out she had the scroll, he would take it, or destroy it, or take her. Tain took the scroll. He hid it in his bosom. The scales on his chest accepted the parchment as a second layer of skin. Outside the window, the sky was turning gray. Dawn in an hour. Tain turned toward the window, stopped, looked at Elaine, said she was risking everything. Her family, her title, her life. Asked why. Elaine answered with a single sentence. She said it was because the last entry in her great-grandmother's diary was an apology to the dead dragons, and that she didn't want to write the same kind of diary for her great-grandchildren. Tain nodded, stepped onto the ledge, jumped down. 3 stories. Landed softly, rolled over, ran across the courtyard in the shadow of the wall, leaped over the fence, made it to the roof, where Kuin was waiting. The guy hadn't been sleeping. He was sitting with his back against a pipe. The black veins had faded. His eyes looked almost normal. He saw Tane. He asked, "So what's up?" Tane pulled out a scroll. Kuin looked at it, then at Tane. He asked, "Is this what I think it is?" Tane replied that it was a death sentence for the Order. They returned to camp by noon the next day. Kuin walked through the shadows in short bursts. 1 kilometer. 2. He couldn't go any further. 200 kilometers in one go had drained him completely. Between bursts, he sat on the ground and breathed. Black veins on his face would appear and then fade. Tane carried him the last stretch. He simply hoisted him onto his shoulder and walked through the forest. Kuin didn't argue. He didn't have the strength to argue. They were waiting for them at the camp. Hagrin sat by the extinguished fire. Sira stood at the edge of the clearing and looked south. Orin slept curled up among the tree roots. Around him, as always, grass and small white flowers had sprouted. Tane laid Kuin down next to Orin. The boy woke up. He saw the black veins. Without a word, he placed his palms on Kuin's chest. Green light flowed inside. Kuin closed his eyes and breathed. Tane took out a scroll. He unrolled it in front of Hagrin. The old man couldn't read the ancient language. Tane translated it aloud, word for word. The Order of the Council of 7 Kings. Begin the destruction with the peaceful ones. Burn the eggs and nests. Rewrite history. Hagrin listened. His face was stony. When Tane finished, the old man was silent for a long time. Then he stood up. He walked over to a tree. He pressed his forehead against the bark. He stood there for a minute. 2. Tane saw his shoulders tremble. For 20 years, Hagrin had known that the purge was wrong. But knowing it in your gut and holding the order in your hands are two different things. It's the difference between suspicion and a verdict. Hagrin returned. He sat down. He said they needed a plan. Tane nodded. There was already a plan. The scroll had to be shown to the world, not whispered in an ear, not passed from hand to hand, shown so that everyone could see it, everyone on the continent. Sira asked how. Tane replied that in 5 days, Averon would celebrate Silver Day, the anniversary of the Order's founding. A parade. Speeches. Master Alaric will speak in the square before thousands of people. Ambassadors from all the kingdoms, the Elven delegation, the church, all of Ered's elite in one place. Tane said he would go out into that square, with a scroll, and he'll make the world read the truth. Hagrin said that was suicide. Tane replied that it wasn't, that suicide was hiding for another year. 2. 10. Until the Order found them all, one by one. Until every child with colored blood was executed. Until the last traces were erased. It was time to stop running. Sarah looked at him for a long time. Then she said she would go with him. Kuin opened his eyes. He said he would too. Hagrin cursed. Then he waved his hand and said he was too old to die of boredom. Orin clung to Tane's arm and said he wouldn't be left alone. Tane looked at the boy, at his green hands, at his serious face. He was 9. He deserved a childhood. But he hadn't had a childhood since the day his aunt handed him over to the men in silver cloaks. Tane crouched down in front of him. He said that Orin would go, but he would stick close to Hagrin, no matter what happened. Orin nodded. 5 days of preparation. Tane trained. Not fire, control. He learned to hold the flame inside until the limit, and then release it precisely and briefly. He learned to move in battle. Hagrid chased him with a stick across the clearing until he himself collapsed from exhaustion. Sira trained the walls, icy barriers, thick, strong, capable of stopping an arrow and a drink. Kuan was recovering, slowly. Orin treated him every day. The black veins were gone. His eyes returned to normal. Kuan began moving through the shadows again. Short leaps. A meter. 2. He couldn't manage more yet. But in the city, that's all you need. There are enough shadows there. On the third day, Hagrid brought a man to the camp. Tane jumped to his feet. Heat surged through his chest. Then he saw who it was. Regan, the commander of the squad he'd met on the road. No cloak, no sword, no insignia. Thin, bruises on his face, dried blood on his lip. His clothes were torn. Hagrid said he'd found him in the woods by the road. Regan had fled from the Citadel's dungeons. Someone had helped him, left the door unlocked. Regan didn't know who exactly. Tane looked at him, with a dragon's gaze. He saw the truth in his eyes. Pain, shame, determination. Regan said he had served the Order for 15 years, that he had believed, that he had executed, that he had kept silent, that after meeting Tane on the road, he couldn't sleep, that he had spent 3 weeks in the Citadel's basement and every night saw the faces of those he had killed, that he wanted to help, that he knew the Citadel, the guards' positions, the patrol routes, the weak spots. Tane asked what he wanted in return. Regan replied that he wanted nothing, that the debt he owed could not be repaid with anything, but at least they could stop adding to it. Tane nodded. He accepted. Regan joined them, 6 of them. With Regan, they gained knowledge, detailed, precise. Where the guards stood in the square, how many there were, how they rotated shifts, where Alaric would be, where the ambassadors were, where the elves were. Regan drew a map of the square on the ground with a stick. He explained. Tane listened. He memorized it. The night before, Tane hadn't slept. He stood in the clearing and looked up at the sky. The stars were bright. The moon was full. Scales covered his body almost completely. His face, his neck, his chest, his back, his arms, his legs down to his knees. Only his feet and palms remained human, and a strip of skin on his stomach. He felt something stirring inside him. Big, hot, bursting to get out. His true form. It was close. Very close. One powerful burst would be enough to trigger his full awakening. He thought about it every day, every hour. If he fully awakened, he would cease to be Tane. He would become an ancient one, a dragon, a creature the size of a mountain. Karagor was like that, his father. Tane ran his hand over the scales on his chest, warm, smooth, his own. Footsteps behind him. Sira. She approached and stood beside him. She said nothing. She just stood there. The steam from her mouth mingled with the smoke from his nostrils. He turned toward her. She turned toward him. Green and orange. Ice and fire. She raised her hand and touched his cheek. Her fingers were icy. His skin was burning hot. Where they touched, the air hissed. A thin stream of vapor between them. She said he would return. Not a question. A statement. Tane didn't answer, but he covered her hand with his. A hot palm over an icy one. They stood like that for a minute. Then Sira withdrew her hand. She turned and walked away. Tane remained. He looked at the stars. Everything would be decided tomorrow. At dawn they set off. Averon was overflowing on the day of the Silver Festival. Thousands of people flocked to the central square. The Order's flags flew on every house, silver and white. Music, merchants, children on their fathers' shoulders, a celebration of victory over the monsters. For 400 years, people had celebrated genocide and called it salvation. Tane looked down at the square from the roof of City Hall. Kuan had led him through the shadows at dawn, in short leaps across the entire city. Sarah had entered through the western gate disguised as a nun. Oren was with her, a small novice with his hood pulled down. Hagrin and Reagan had passed through the southern gate as retired mercenaries. The silver pommel of the sword was hidden under a rag. 6 of them in the city, among thousands. Silver Shield Square, the largest open space in Averon. Stone pavement, a fountain in the center. A platform by the northern wall. A podium on the platform. Flags, seats for the nobility. A throne for the king, which was empty because the king was ill and had sent the chancellor in his place. But Eileen was there. Tane saw her. 3rd row, dark hair, green eyes, a calm face. She knew he would come. They hadn't agreed on it, but she knew. Master Alaric stood at the podium, tall, upright, white hair, silver armor, a cloak bearing the Order's crest. 2 bodyguards stood beside him. Behind the podium, 100 knights in full dress uniform, spears, swords, shields. Alaric began his speech. His voice was strong, well modulated. He spoke of duty and sacrifice, of 400 years of peace, of how the Order stood guard, of how the darkness of winged creatures would never return as long as the silver spear remained in the hands of the faithful. Tane listened. The scales beneath his cloak burned. The heat pulsed in time with his heart. Alaric spoke of recent events, about the bearers of corruption who roam the southern counties, about the heresy spreading among the common folk. He promised that the Order would find and destroy every bearer, that the blood of the creatures would not defile the land of Irad. The crowd listened, not all with enthusiasm. Tane saw with his dragon's vision, hundreds of faces, hundreds of expressions. Many nodded, but many did not. They stood with tight lips. They looked away. They exchanged glances. Doubt. It was already within them, sown over months of whispers and nocturnal wonders in the villages. Alaric finished his speech. The crowd applauded. Not all of them, but enough to sound convincing. Alaric turned toward the podium and raised his hand. The parade began. Tane stood up. He threw off his cloak. Scales flashed in the sun. Scarlet, bright, each plate like a tiny ruby. His face, his neck, his hands, everything was covered. His eyes burned orange, vertical pupils. He stood on the edge of the town hall roof, directly above the square. Thousands of people below, and he above them, the son of the last ancient. He jumped, not down, forward, across the square, toward the platform. 20 meters in the air, his body sliced through the air like a stone from a catapult. He landed on the cobblestones 10 paces from the platform. The stone cracked beneath his feet. Dust flew up. The crowd recoiled. Someone screamed. Someone fell. The guards rushed forward, swords out of their sheaths. Alaric froze on the platform. He looked at Tane. His face was pale, his eyes wide. He knew who he was looking at. Tane straightened up, raised his head, stood at full height. Tall, taller than anyone in the square. His scales glowed in the sun. He raised his hand, and a pillar of fire burst from his palm. Upward, into the sky. 5 meters. 10. Orange with a white core. The crowd froze. Silence. absolute. Thousands of people held their breath. Tayan extinguished the fire. He lowered his hand. The silence rang out. He spoke. His voice was steady, loud, not a shout, but the whole square heard him. He said his name was Tayan, that he was 16 years old, that he was the son of Karagor the Red, the last ancient dragon whom the Order had killed 17 years ago. That he was not a monster, not a beast, not an abomination. That he was a man, half a man, and the other half, he was the heir to a people who lived on this land before humans built the first house. Guards surrounded him. 20 swords, 30. Tayan didn't move. He spoke. He said that the Order had been killing children for 400 years, that in 50 years it had executed 15 bearers. The last one was 12. His name was Fane. His crime was that scaly spots had appeared on his hands. For that, he was beheaded and burned. There was whispering in the square. People exchanged glances. Alaric raised his hand. He ordered them to shoot. Archers on the walls drew their bows. Tayan saw it. 20 arrows, aimed at him. He didn't move. Sira stepped out of the crowd. She threw off her monastic cloak. White hair, gray eyes, pale skin with scales visible on her cheekbones. She stood before Tayan. She raised her hands. A wall of ice rose from the pavement, a semicircle, 3 meters high, transparent, glistening. The arrows struck the ice and got stuck. The crowd gasped. Sira held the wall. Her face was motionless, her hands raised. A chill emanated from her that could be felt even in the back rows. Tayan continued. He pulled a scroll from his bosom, raised it above his head, said it was an order from the Council of the Seven Kings from the first day of the Purge, authentic, with seals. That the order stated the dragons did not strike first, that they were destroyed for refusing to pass on their knowledge, that the extermination began with the peaceful, with those who could not fight, with healers and children, that the order was built on lies, that for 400 years people had celebrated murder and called it a feat. Alaric rushed toward the podium. He snatched a spear from a guard, a silver one, a real peem, one of those forged specifically to kill the ancients. He leaped from the platform. The 50-year-old man moved like a 30-year-old, training and hatred. He leaped over the wall of ice. The spear was aimed at Tayan's chest. Tayan saw him. His dragon's vision revealed everything: the trajectory, speed, the point of impact, and Alaric's eyes. There was no malice in them. There was pain, old, deep. A wife and children killed in a dragon attack. Alaric was no villain. He was a man who had lost everything and dedicated his life to ensuring no one else would lose anything. And he was wrong. Terribly and irreparably wrong. Tayan didn't strike him with fire. He intercepted the spear with his hands. The shaft cracked in his fingers. The dragon bone tip split. The bone of his ancestors turned into a weapon. He crushed it like glass. Tayan held Alaric by the arm. The Magister struggled. He punched. Tayan didn't let go. He didn't strike back. He just held him, like an adult holds a child in the throes of a tantrum. He spoke to him quietly, so that only Alaric could hear. What he knew about his family. What he understood. That he didn't blame him for the pain, but that one man's pain didn't justify the murder of an entire people. Alaric froze. He looked Tayan in the eyes. Orange against brown. Dragon and man. Then Alaric went limp. He didn't give in. He was spent. Like a spring that had been held taut for 50 years and had finally snapped. Tayan let him go. Alaric fell to his knees on the cobblestones. Tayan turned to the crowd. Thousands of faces. Thousands of eyes. He raised the scroll again. Elaine stood on the platform. Her voice was clear. pure. She confirmed the scroll's authenticity. She said she had found it in the royal archives, that the seals were genuine, that the order had known the truth and concealed it for 400 years. A murmur rose in the square. Not a shout, a cup. Thousands of voices at once. Shock, disbelief, anger, confusion. The guards didn't know what to do. The knights on the platform looked at one another. Some lowered their weapons. Others held them. Reagan stepped out of the crowd, without a cloak, without insignia, but they recognized him. Commander Reagan, arrested for cowardice. He stood next to Tain, facing his former brothers, and said that Tain was telling the truth, that he had seen him on the road, that the carrier hadn't attacked, that he had spoken, that in his lifetime, Reagan had killed those he was ordered to kill, and it would never happen again. 3 knights from the ceremonial line lowered their lances, then 2 more, then another, one after another. Not all of them, but more than half. The silver lances clattered against the stone pavement, the clang of metal. Alaric knelt and stared at the ground. Tain felt a jolt, not from the outside, from within. Heat surged from his core, from the very center, from the place where his inner fire had burned ever since the day his mother revealed the truth. Heat filled his body, every cell, every scale. He felt his bones shifting, how his muscles stretched, how his skin cracked and gave way to scales. Awakening, complete. Now. The ground beneath the square shook, a tremor, familiar, primordial. It stirred down there. Tain felt it, enormous, ancient, hungry, awakening. Alaric was right about one thing. Dragon blood was awakening it. 5 bearers in one place. Tain on the threshold of his true form. It was a call, a signal. The primordial responded. The ground shook again, stronger. Stones rained down from the walls. People screamed. The crowd rushed toward the exits. Chaos. Tain stood in the middle of the square. Inside him, everything was burning. His body was tearing to break free. He could hold it back, could stop the awakening. Breathe through his nose. Control, just as his mother had taught him. But then the primordial would too awaken, and there would be no one to stop it. The scroll in the temple spoke clearly. We need those in whose blood memory lives. The ancients put the firstborn to sleep 1,000 years ago, 12 dragons and 100 men. Now there were no dragons. There were bearers, 4 half-awakened, and 1 on the threshold. Tain closed his eyes. The memory of blood surged like a river, not a dream, a torrent, thousands of images at once. He saw Caragor. He saw his father. He saw his grandfather. He saw the chain of the ancients stretching back through the millennia. And he saw the ritual. 12 dragons standing in a circle atop the highest mountain of Arad, Mount Kalit, where Caragor died, where it all began and ended. The dragons roared, flames of different colors intertwined into a pillar, reaching into the sky and the earth at the same time. They were driving the firstborn back into slumber, with the power of their blood. 12 back then, and now. Tain opened his eyes. He looked at Sira, at Kuin, at Orin. 3, and him. 4. Not 12, but the 4 elements. Fire, ice, life, darkness. All 4 foundations. The scroll in the temple said that the elements were more important than numbers, that 4 elements in harmony equal 12 of a single element. The earth shook. A crack ran across the square. Heat radiated from it. Not his heat, someone else's. Ancient. Tain made a decision. He turned to his companions, to Sira, to Kuin, to Orin, who was clutching Hagrin's arm, to Hagrin, who stood pale but upright, sword in hand, to Regan, who didn't understand what was happening but didn't back down. Tane said that the primordial was awakening, that it was below, that they needed to climb Kalit, that they had to do what their ancestors had done 1,000 years ago. Sira asked if the four of them could handle it. Tane replied that he didn't know. But there was no choice. He raised his head to the sky. He inhaled, deeply, to the very bottom, and he stopped holding back. Heat surged outward, from every pore, from every scale. His body began to grow, to change. His bones lengthened with a crack. His muscles swelled. His skin vanished completely beneath the scales. His arms stretched out. His fingers fused into claws. Claws sprang from the tips, white, sharp, long as swords. My back exploded with pain. Wings. 2 enormous, membranous wings burst outward. My shirt flew apart in shreds. The wings unfurled. Red, dark scarlet with streaks of fire. A wingspan of 5 meters. 10, 15. Tane grew. Taller than the houses. Taller than the walls. His head elongated. His jaw became a maw. Teeth grew. Long. White. He stood on 4 paws. His tail lashed the pavement and knocked over the fountain. Stone shattered like glass. The people in the square who hadn't yet fled stood and watched. They didn't move. They couldn't. For the first time in 400 years, a dragon rose above Averon. Scarlet. Huge. The size of a house. No, bigger. It kept growing. 2 houses. 3. Tane felt its growth slowing. Not like Caragor's. His father was the size of a mountain. Tane wasn't yet, but enough. He raised his head. His neck was long, flexible, powerful. He looked down at the square. Tiny figures. People. Among them were his friends. Sira stood with her head tilted back. Her white hair fluttered in the heat radiating from his body. There was no fear in her eyes, only admiration and tears. Orin clung to Hagrin and stared with his mouth agape. Small, green, alive. Cuin stood in the shadow of the wall. He looked up, and for the first time he smiled, truly. Ollery stood on his knees amid the ruins of the fountain. He looked at Tine, and he wept, not out of fear, out of beauty. Because Hagrin had been right back then, by Caragor's body. The ancients were beautiful, even to those who killed them. Tane spread his wings. He pushed off the ground. The pavement cracked beneath his paws. He took flight, for the first time in his life. The air caught him. His wings beat once, twice. He rose, above the square, above the rooftops, above the walls of Averon, above the fields and forests, higher, toward the clouds. Below, the city stood still. Thousands of people stood in the streets and looked up. The shadow of a dragon fell upon Averon. For the first time in 400 years, Tane roared. The sound rolled across all of Arad, from sea to sea. He flew north, toward Mount Kalit, toward the place where his father had died, toward the place where, 1,000 years ago, the ancients had put the firstborn to sleep. Below, the earth trembled. Cracks crept across the fields. Heat and stench rose from the fissures. The firstborn was rising. Tane flew faster. The wind roared in his ears. His wings sliced through the clouds. He sensed the 3 of them below. Seru, Cuin, Orina. They were running north. Hagrin and Regan were with them. They couldn't fly, but they were walking. They needed time to get there. Teen had to give them that time. He reached Kalit by sunset, the mountain, the highest on the continent. The summit was covered in snow. He landed on the peak. His claws dug into the rock. Here, on this rock, Karagor had died. Teen could feel him. A trace, an echo, a warmth that hadn't cooled in 17 years. He lay down on the rock, scarlet scales against the gray granite. He closed his eyes and waited. The earth trembled. The mountain swayed. The primordial rose. Teen waited for his people. They arrived on the third day. Kuin led them through the shadows, in short, jerky bursts. But he led them. Sarah, Kuin, Orin, Hagrin, Reagan. They stood at the foot of the mountain and looked up, at the dragon on the summit, scarlet, huge, beautiful. Teen lowered his head. The huge dragon's face was level with their own. Its eyes were orange, each one the size of a wagon wheel. Orin stepped forward. A little boy stood before the dragon's head. He reached out his hand. He touched the scales on Tane's nose. A green light flashed. Tane felt him. Small, warm, alive, unafraid, not at all. Tane exhaled. Warm air washed over Orin. The boy laughed. Sira climbed up the slope. She stood before him. She raised her hand. Ice covered her palm. She placed her palm against Tane's scales. Heat and cold, steam, resonance, blood to blood. Kuin stood in the shadow of the mountain. The darkness around him pulsed. He didn't approach. But Tane saw. He saw that Kuin was ready, that his darkness awaited a command. The earth struck, harder than all the times before. The rock cracked. Heat poured from the crack. Orange, not dragons, ancient. The primordial was right beneath them. Tane rose, spread his wings, roared, called, not to people, to blood. Sira answered. A stream of icy air shot into the sky, a white pillar. Kuin answered. Darkness rose around him like a black fountain. Orin knelt. He placed his hands on the stone. A green light shot up the mountain. Grass and flowers sprouted from the stone. Impossible. Alive. On bare rock at a height where nothing grows. The four elements. Fire, ice, darkness, life. Teen opened his mouth and exhaled. Not a stream, a torrent. Everything he had. Fire struck the sky and the earth at the same time, like a vision of the memory of blood. A pillar of flame pierced the clouds and shot down through the stone, toward the primordial. Sarah added her stream. A white, icy wind intertwined with the fire. It did not extinguish it. It intensified it. Fire and ice became one, just as the scroll had said, two faces of a single power. Kuin released darkness. A black pillar wrapped around the intertwining of fire and ice. It became a boundary, a wall. The darkness did not extinguish. It held. It restrained. It pressed down. Orin poured in life. Green light pierced everything. Fire, ice, darkness. It bound. It wove. It made whole. The four elements in harmony. The mountain trembled. The stone melted. The primordial roared below. Tane felt it. Vast. Older than the mountains. Older than the dragons. Older than anything. It was bursting upward. It wanted to awaken. It wanted to emerge. Tane pressed down. With everything he had. With all his blood. With all his strength. With all the memory of his father and grandfather and the thousands of ancients who lived in his blood. He was not 12 dragons. He was one. But within him was the memory of them all. 1,000 years of experience. 1,000 years of power. Compressed into a single being. A pillar of fire and ice and darkness and life struck downward. Through stone. Through rock. For miles. Reached the firstborn. And drove it back. Into sleep. Into silence. Into the darkness from which it had risen. The earth stopped trembling, instantly, as if someone had turned off the sound. Silence fell upon the mountain, absolute. Tane closed his mouth. The fire went out. Sarah lowered her hands. The ice melted. Kuan collapsed to his knees. The darkness dissipated. Orin lay on a rock, his eyes closed. The green light on his hands had faded. But he was breathing. Everyone was breathing. Tane stood atop Kalit, the crimson dragon on Ered's highest mountain. Clouds below him. Stars above him. Silence all around. The firstborn had fallen asleep. Again. He didn't know for how long. But today the world had held firm. He lowered his head. He looked at his people. Sira sat on a rock, pale. Exhausted, but alive. She raised her head and looked at him. She smiled. For the first time ever. A real smile. Kuan lay on his back and looked up at the sky. The black veins on his face were slowly fading away on their own, without Orin's help, as if the body had finally accepted the darkness not as a disease, but as a part of itself. Orin opened his eyes. He looked at his hands. The green had receded to his shoulders. But the boy wasn't afraid. He smiled. He raised his hand, and a flower grew from his palm. White, on the bare rock, small and stubborn. Ha-Hagrin sat leaning against the rock. His heart beat steadily. Tine could hear it. For the first time, without skipping a beat. Orin was healing him, along the way. Quietly, without asking, just placing his hands on the old man's chest while he slept. Hagrin looked at Tine, at the dragon, at the son of his old acquaintance, and in his eyes there was neither pain, nor guilt, nor regret, only peace. Regan stood at the edge of the cliff and looked down, at the world, at Ered, which would never be the same again. Tine raised his head, spread his wings. The wind struck his membranes. He felt his body, every scale, every muscle, every bone. He was a dragon, an ancient one, the first in 400 years. But he was also Tine, the boy from Haven, the son of the herbalist, who loved silence and tea in the mornings, and whose hands trembled when he breathed fire for the first time. He hadn't lost himself. Blood hadn't won. He had won over blood. He hadn't suppressed it. He hadn't stifled it. He had accepted it. He had become whole, man and dragon, one. He looked south. Somewhere out there was Averon. Somewhere out there was Elaine with the scroll. Somewhere out there were thousands of people who had seen him, who knew the truth, who would no longer remain silent. The world had changed today. Not completely. Years lie ahead, perhaps decades. The Order won't collapse in a day. The elves won't back down. The kings won't admit guilt. But the crack has become a fault line. The fault line will become an abyss. And from that abyss, the truth will rise. Slowly. Stubbornly. Like an Orin flower on bare rock. Tane took a deep breath. A full breath. And breathed fire into the sky. A pillar of flame shot into the clouds. Scarlet. bright, visible for hundreds of kilometers. Across Arad, people raised their heads and saw fire in the sky. Above Kalit, where the last dragon had perished 400 years ago, now the first stood there. They said we had been wiped out. Today, Tain rewrote his lineage with his own fire.